Greetings everyone, this is OMNI Wizard. Prepare yourselves for what if every Horcrux Harry destroyed gave him one of Voldemort's powers. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Ring and the Reckoning. The forest had gone quiet the way forests do right before something changes, and Harry Potter did not like that kind of quiet at all. He sat cross-legged on the damp ground with the ring balanced on his palm, turning it so the black stone caught the low firelight. It looked so ordinary. A cracked band of gold, a jagged stone set crooked in its mount, a crack running through the symbol carved into it like a scar that never healed properly. It didn't feel like the end of the world. It felt like something you'd find in your grandmother's jewelry box and forget about. You're just going to look at it, Ron said. He was crouched by the fire, feeding it twigs one at a time like he needed something to do with his hands. Because we could also, destroy it. That's sort of the plan. I'm getting there. You've been getting there for 20 minutes, Ron. Hermione's voice had that particular edge that meant she was 2 seconds from snapping at both of them, which was fair, because they'd been 3 teenagers in a tent in the middle of nowhere for weeks now, and everyone's nerves had worn thin as old parchment. She had the sword of Gryffindor across her knees, wrapped in an old jumper to keep the firelight off the blade, like that would somehow make it less obviously a legendary weapon. Let him look at it. If Dumbledore's notes are right, whatever's inside that thing might fight back. Fight back how? I don't know, Ron. That's rather the point of not knowing. Harry turned the ring over once more. He could feel it now that he was paying attention, a low thrum against his palm, like holding something with a heartbeat. Not warm, cold, if anything, but present, the way the locket back in his second year had felt present in his bag before he'd known what it was, a low itch at the edge of awareness that something in the room was watching him back. He set it down on a flat stone in the middle of their little clearing and stood up. Right, he said. Sword. Hermione unwrapped the blade and passed it to him hilt first, the way you'd pass someone a very sharp and very expensive kitchen knife. The rubies in the pommel glowed faintly, the way they always did when there was dark magic close by, and Harry thought, not for the first time, that the sword seemed to want this. Like it had been forged for exactly this and had spent 500 years waiting for someone to finally ask. Okay, Ron said, backing up several steps. Do it before I lose my nerve on your behalf. Harry lifted the sword. He'd done this once before. A basilisk fang through a diary in a flooded chamber, 5 years and a lifetime ago, and he remembered the scream that had come out of it, high and inhuman and furious, like something that had never once been denied anything was suddenly being denied everything. He braced himself for that. He braced for the ink, for the black smoke, for the way the world had gone strange and thin around him afterward, like reality had been stretched too tight over something rotten. He was not braced for what actually happened. The sword went through the stone clean, no resistance at all, the way a blade goes through water. And for half a second nothing happened. No scream, no smoke, nothing, and Harry had time to think stupidly, maybe it's already dead, maybe Dumbledore already, and then the world came apart at the seams. It wasn't pain, not exactly, though pain was somewhere in it. It was more like being unzipped from the inside, like every nerve in his body had been rewired in the space of a heartbeat, and none of the new wiring matched the old. He heard himself make a sound he'd never made before, low and strangled, and he was on his knees, though he didn't remember his legs deciding to fold. Somewhere very far away Hermione was shouting his name, and Ron was saying something about the sword, don't let go of the sword, and none of it seemed to matter half as much as the thing happening behind his eyes. He saw a boy. Small, thin, dark-haired, standing in a cupboard-sized room in an orphanage that smelled of carbolic soap and despair, and the boy was maybe 6 years old and utterly, perfectly unafraid of the dark. Other children screamed at the shadows in that room. This one had made the shadows scream instead once, just to see if he could, and the look on his face when he'd done it hadn't been fear or triumph. It had been satisfaction. The satisfaction of a scientist confirming a hypothesis. Harry saw more. A boy older now, sorted into green and silver, standing in front of a mirror that should have shown him something and instead showed him nothing at all, because he had already decided there was nothing in himself worth reflecting. He saw a hand, not his own hand, never his own, closing around a wand for the first time and knowing, immediately and completely, the way you know your own name, that this was a tool that would never be permitted to master him. He saw fear, actual fear, offered to that boy like a weapon by teachers and boggarts and things with claws, and he saw the boy simply set it aside. Not conquer it, not overcome it. Set it aside the way you'd set aside a coat that didn't fit, because fear required believing that something outside yourself could end you, and this boy had never once believed that. Then it was gone, snapped away like a curtain yanked shut, and Harry was on all fours in the wet grass with the sword still gripped white-knuckled in his hand and Hermione's face 6 inches from his, pale and terrified in the firelight. "Harry, Harry, can you hear me? I can hear you." His voice came out wrong, too steady for how his body felt. Give me a second. You screamed," Ron said. He hadn't moved from where he'd backed up to, and he was holding his wand now, pointed at nothing in particular, the way you point a wand when you don't know what you're supposed to be pointing it at. "You screamed and then you just stopped, and your eyes went what? Red, for a second, just red and then green again." Harry sat back on his heels. His heart was going like a hammer, but underneath the hammering there was something else, something new, spreading through his chest like heat from a fire he hadn't lit himself. He looked down at the ruined ring on the stone. The stone inside it had cracked clean through now, a black line running its whole length, and the gold band around it had gone dull and lifeless, a dead thing finally allowed to look dead. "It worked," he said. "Clearly something worked," Hermione said. She hadn't moved back. Her hand was still on his shoulder, gripping hard enough to hurt, and he didn't think she'd noticed. "Harry, what happened? What did you see?" he told them. It came out haltingly at first and then faster. The orphanage, the mirror, the boy who decided fear was optional and simply never picked it back up. Ron's face went through several expressions in quick succession, confusion, then alarm, then something that looked almost like offense, like this was deeply unfair on a personal level. "So you what?" he said finally. "You just absorbed him, like some kind of, I don't know, magical sponge." "I don't think it's him," Hermione said slowly. She let go of Harry's shoulder and had her arms wrapped around herself instead, the way she did when she was thinking hard and didn't like where the thinking was taking her. "I think, Harry, when you destroyed the diary in second year, that was a Horcrux too, a whole piece of his soul, and it just vanished. No scream even close to like this. No visions. Nothing came back, so why now? I don't know, maybe it's the ring specifically. Maybe there's something different about how it was made," or she stopped, and Harry watched her think it through in real time, the way she always did, turning the problem over like a puzzle box looking for the seam. "Or maybe it's not about which Horcrux. Maybe it's about how many you've destroyed. Maybe the diaries, I don't know, held in reserve somehow, waiting for a second one to break so the magic has somewhere to go." "That's mental," Ron said. "Everything about this is mental, Ronald. I'm doing my best." Harry wasn't really listening anymore. He was looking at his own hands, turning them over the way he'd turned the ring over 10 minutes before, and he was aware of a stillness inside himself that had not been there an hour ago. Not calm exactly, his heart was still hammering, his hands were still faintly shaking with adrenaline, but underneath all of that, in the part of him that had spent 6 years flinching at dementors and nightmares, and the memory of a green light in a nursery, there was something new sitting very quietly and very confidently, like a guest who had just been shown to a room and found it entirely to his liking. "I am not afraid," he thought, testing the words the way you test ice on a pond, waiting for the crack. There was no crack. The thought simply sat there, true. "Try something," he said out loud. Ron blinked. "Try what? Scare me. What, like jump out at you?" "I don't know, do the thing with the spider you did in third year when you thought there was one under my bed. Anything." Ron looked at Hermione, who shrugged, clearly as curious as he was despite the seriousness of everything else. Ron cleared his throat, drew himself up, and in a low, theatrical voice said, "Harry, behind you, it's massive." Harry didn't turn around. He felt distantly the shape of the old reflex, the little jolt of adrenaline that used to send his hand for his wand whenever anyone said something like that in the dark, and it simply didn't fire. There was no jolt, there was no impulse to turn. There was just Ron standing by a fire trying to scare him and failing completely and looking increasingly baffled about it. "Nothing," Harry said. "Try harder. There's a Dementor," Ron tried, "right there, behind the tree." "It's coming this way, Harry. Oh, forget it. This is stupid. You're not even blinking." "I know. That's not, mate. That's not normal. You've been scared of Dementors since we were 13. "I know," Harry said again, and there was something in his own voice now that he didn't quite recognize, a low current of something that might have been wonder and might have been something colder. "I'm not anymore. I don't think I can be." Hermione had gone very still. "Harry, that's not just about nerve. Fear is a defense against things that can genuinely kill you. If you've lost that entirely, that's not brave, that's dangerous," Harry said. "I know that too." They looked at each other across the dying fire, the three of them, and none of them said the thing that was sitting underneath everything else, obvious as the ring cracked open on the stone between them. That if destroying 2 Horcruxes had done this, there were still 5 more out there, and Harry Potter was going to keep destroying them. 300 miles south, in a manor house that had once belonged to a family whose name no one dared speak above a whisper anymore, Lord Voldemort stopped mid-sentence. He was in the drawing room at Malfoy Manor, standing at the head of a long table with perhaps a dozen of his most trusted followers seated along its length, and he had been in the process of outlining, with his usual patient precision, exactly how the ministry's new regulations on Muggle-born registration were to be enforced across the southern counties. Lucius Malfoy was taking notes. Bellatrix was watching her master's face with the fixed, adoring attention of a woman who had built her entire remaining life around never missing a single flicker of his mood. She was the one who noticed first. "My lord," Voldemort did not answer immediately. His long white fingers resting on the table's edge had gone rigid, and something had happened behind his red eyes that none of them had ever seen there before, not fury, which was familiar to all of them, but something quieter and stranger, a flicker of what might almost have been surprise. He had felt his Horcruxes before. It was not a sensation he discussed with anyone, not even Bellatrix, not even Severus, but he was always, distantly, aware of them, the way you are aware of your own limbs even with your eyes closed. A faint ambient hum at the edge of consciousness, confirming that a piece of you exists somewhere else, safe, waiting. He had felt the diary's destruction 6 years ago, a small, sharp absence like a tooth pulled, and he had raged about it privately and then set the matter aside, because one piece lost among 7 still left him more anchored to the world than any wizard in history. This was different. This was the ring, his mother's ring, his grandfather's ring, the ring he had killed for and worn with more pride than he had ever admitted to feeling about anything, and its destruction did not simply register as an absence. It registered as a transfer. He had never felt anything like it. For one disorienting instant it was as though a door he had not known existed swung open somewhere inside the architecture of his own magic, and something of his, something that had been his, that belonged to no one else, a fragment of will and memory and self he had poured into that ring decades ago when he was still young enough to believe immortality could be built like a house, brick by careful brick, simply left, not destroyed. Not annihilated the way the ordinary murder of a Horcrux should feel, brutal and final, taken, redirected, like water diverted from one channel into another he could not see the end of. "My lord," Bellatrix said again, more urgently now, and half the table had gone silent, sensing that something significant was happening even if they couldn't name it. "Someone," Voldemort said slowly, "has destroyed something of mine." The room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Lucius set down his quill very carefully, as though sudden movements might draw attention he didn't want. "The ring," Voldemort said, and it wasn't a question, though none of them had any idea what ring he meant, because none of them, not even Bellatrix, not even Snape, knew the full truth of what he had done to guarantee his own survival all those years ago. Only that he had. Only that certain objects, certain places, mattered to him in ways he never fully explained and no one was foolish enough to ask about twice. "My lord," said Yaxley carefully from halfway down the table, "if something of yours has been damaged, surely we should mobilize. Find whoever is responsible. I can have the snatchers redoubled within the hour. We can. I know who is responsible." Voldemort's voice was very quiet, and quiet from him was always worse than shouting. "There is only one person alive fool enough and lucky enough to have found it." Bellatrix's dark eyes lit with something eager and vicious. "Potter, Potter," Voldemort agreed. He was still for a long moment, his gaze fixed on some point past the far wall, past the manor, past the county, seeing something none of them could follow. When he spoke again his tone had shifted, the surprise gone, replaced by the cold, methodical calculation that had made him the most feared wizard in Britain for half a century. "The boy has help I did not anticipate him having. He is finding things that should not be findable. That is troubling. But what is more troubling," and here he paused, and something crossed his pale face that Bellatrix, for all her devotion, could not quite read, "is that when it broke, I felt something leave that did not simply cease to exist. I felt it go somewhere." "Go where, my lord?" Bellatrix breathed. "I don't know," Voldemort said, and it cost him something visible to admit it. His followers had rarely, if ever, heard him say those 3 words in that order. "But I intend to find out. Severus." At the far end of the table, in the shadow near the door where he habitually positioned himself, Severus Snape's expression did not change at all, which was, for those who knew him, its own kind of tell. "My lord. You will keep your ear to Hogwarts. If the boy has been near the school, if anything of significance has been disturbed there, I want to know immediately. In Bellatrix, the Snatchers are to redouble their patrols along every road out of the southwest. If Potter is moving with whatever protection he's found, he will need to eat, he will need to sleep, and eventually he will make a mistake." He rose from his seat, and the movement alone was enough to make every wizard at the table straighten in their chairs. "Find him. I want him found alive, and I want him found quickly. Something is happening that I do not yet understand, and I have never in my life permitted a thing I do not understand to continue unexamined." He left the room without another word, robes whispering against the floor, and behind him the table erupted into low, urgent conversation, plans forming and reforming, and none of them, not Bellatrix, not Yaxley, not even Snape, standing very still in his shadowed corner with his mind working faster and colder than any of them could guess, had the faintest idea that the Dark Lord had just described, with perfect if unwitting accuracy, the exact mechanism by which he was slowly, Horcrux by Horcrux, arming his own executioner. They struck camp before dawn, moving the tent 3 miles east through wet bracken and low mist, because Hermione's rule, one of many, and none of them argued with her about it anymore, was that they never slept 2 nights running in the same spot. Harry walked point with the sword strapped across his back where the sheath used to hold nothing more dangerous than a broom, and he was aware as he walked of how quiet the forest had gone around him. Not silent, just unthreatening. Every rustle in the underbrush that would once have made his hand twitch toward his wand now registered as exactly what it was. A bird, a rabbit, wind through dead leaves. Nothing more. "You're doing the thing again," Ron said from a few paces behind him. "What thing?" "The thing where you walk like you're not worried about anything jumping out of the trees at us. It's unsettling. You used to at least pretend to be nervous for our benefit. Would it help if I pretended?" "Enormously, yeah." Hermione, walking with the beaded bag slung over one shoulder and her wand in her free hand, wasn't laughing. "It's not really a joke, Ron. If Harry's genuinely lost the capacity to feel fear, that's a problem, not a party trick. Fear tells you when to run. I can still tell when I should run," Harry said. "I just don't feel it the way I used to." It's not recklessness, Hermione. I still know what's dangerous. I just don't feel my body trying to talk me out of dealing with it. That's exactly what worries me." They didn't get to finish the argument because that was when the voice came out of the trees ahead of them, low and rough and entirely too pleased with itself. Well, out for a morning stroll, are we?" There were 5 of them spread in a loose crescent across the path, and Harry recognized the leader immediately from the description Bill had given them months ago at the wedding. The matted gray hair, the yellowed teeth filed unnaturally sharp, the particular hunger in the eyes that had nothing to do with actual hunger. Fenrir Greyback. Behind him, 4 snatchers in ragged robes, wands already drawn, grinning the way men grin when they think the hard part of their day is already over. 3 little runaways, Greyback said, taking a slow step forward, sniffing the air theatrically. "Don't get many this far out. Ministry doesn't pay for effort, you know, just for warm bodies dragged in. But some warm bodies are worth more than others." His eyes had found the scar half hidden beneath Harry's fringe, and his grin widened into something with far too many teeth in it. "Now there's a face I know." "Careful," said one of the other snatchers, a wiry man with a scarred cheek. "That's mate, that's supposed to be. I know exactly who it's supposed to be." Greyback's eyes hadn't left Harry's face. "Question is what he's doing wandering about with just a red head and a mudblood for company, when there's a whole world of people who'd love to know exactly where he is." Ron's wand came up instantly, and Hermione's a half-beat behind him, and 6 months ago Harry's would have been right there with them, his heart already hammering, his mind already racing through half-remembered dueling theory and the crushing awareness of how badly this could go wrong. Instead, Harry took a slow step forward, ahead of both of them, and felt nothing at all where the fear should have been. Just a kind of flat, clear certainty, the way you feel certain about arithmetic. "You should let us pass," he said. Greyback laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "Should I?" "Yeah." Harry hadn't drawn his wand yet. He didn't feel any particular urgency to. "You've got 5 of you and I've got 2 friends who are better duelists than every name on your little snatcher payroll, and you're about to find out what happens when you corner someone who isn't scared of you." "Big talk," said the scarred one. "For a kid who's about to." Greyback didn't bother waiting for him to finish. He raised his wand and snarled a curse, something ugly and cutting, meant to open flesh, and it was the fastest Harry had seen anyone move since Bellatrix Lestrange in the Department of Mysteries, and it should have hit him, would have hit him a year ago while he was still fumbling for his own wand. Instead, Harry's hand was already up, wandless, and the curse hit something that wasn't quite a shield and wasn't quite anything he'd learned in 6 years of magical education. It simply stopped, an inch from his chest, hanging in the air like it had run into glass before it guttered out entirely. The forest went very quiet. "That's not possible," said the wiry snatcher in a voice that had lost all its earlier confidence. "Apparently it is," Harry said, and drew his wand at last, almost as an afterthought because it felt rude not to. "Ron, Hermione, stand back a second." Harry, Hermione started. I've got this. He didn't shout it. He didn't need to. There was something in the flat certainty of his voice that made even Ron, who had known him for 6 years and loved him like a brother, and had never once heard him talk like that, take an involuntary step backward. Greyback recovered fastest of the 5, snarling something about impossible tricks and lucky shields, and came at Harry not with magic this time, but with his whole body, teeth bared, claws, actual claws, half transformed, moon madness bleeding through even in daylight, reaching for his throat. Harry didn't flinch, he didn't step back. He simply raised his wand, said, "Incarcerus," in a voice that carried none of the panic the spell usually came wrapped in, and thick ropes erupted from the air and wrapped Greyback from ankle to throat mid-lunge, sending him crashing face first into the dirt 3 feet short of his target. The other 4 snatchers opened fire all at once, a ragged volley of curses, stunners, one particularly nasty severing charm from the scarred man, and Harry moved through it the way you'd move through rain you decided you weren't going to let bother you. He didn't dodge so much as redirect, his wand tracing quick, economical arcs, each spell meeting an incoming curse and simply unmaking it, the way water unmakes a fire it's poured onto. He wasn't even breathing hard. Behind him, he heard Ron shout something and a snatcher go down with a leglocker curse, heard Hermione's voice snap out a stunner that dropped a second one clean, and some distant part of Harry's mind noted with satisfaction that his friends hadn't needed rescuing at all. They'd simply had the field cleared for them, room to fight properly instead of scrambling for their lives. The scarred snatcher, seeing his companions dropping one by one, made the smart choice and turned to run. Harry let him go 3 steps before flicking his wand almost lazily, and the man's legs simply stopped obeying him, tangling together mid-stride, sending him sprawling into the bracken. That left Greyback, still bound in rope, twisting on the ground with an expression on his face that had shifted from hunger to something closer to genuine animal alarm. Harry crouched down beside him, unhurried, and Greyback actually flinched back from him, Fenrir Greyback, who had spent 30 years being the thing that made other people flinch. "Here's what's going to happen," Harry said, quietly enough that it was almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "You're going to lie there until the ropes wear off on their own, which will be a few hours, and you're going to think very hard about whether you want to go back and tell your master that you found Harry Potter in the woods and he walked away from all 5 of you without breaking a sweat. Because if you do tell him that, he's going to ask you why you didn't stop me, and you won't have a good answer." "You're a boy," Greyback snarled, though there was less conviction in it now than there had been 2 minutes ago. "You're nothing, whatever trick you're pulling." "It's not a trick," Harry stood back up. "It's just true. You should have felt something when you looked at me just now, something in your gut telling you to back off. That's fear and it's usually right, and you should have listened to it." He turned and walked back to Ron and Hermione, who were standing very close together, staring at him with matching expressions that were not quite fear and not quite awe but somewhere restless and uncertain in between. "That was," Ron started and stopped and tried again. "Mate, you didn't even use half the spells you know how to use. You didn't even try. I didn't need to. That's what worries me," Hermione said quietly. They gathered their things and left the snatchers where they lay. Ron wanted to hex a few extra insults into the scarred one on principle, and Hermione dragged him along by the sleeve before he could, and walked another 2 miles before any of them spoke again, the forest closing back around them, mist curling low across the path. "Can I ask you something?" Ron said eventually, "and you actually answer honestly, not the calm, sorted-out version of honestly you've been doing since the ring thing." "Yeah." "Does it scare you? What's happening to you?" Harry thought about it. He thought about the version of himself from a year ago who would have answered instantly, "Of course it does," because that was the correct, reassuring, humble thing to say, the thing that let Ron and Hermione feel like they were still walking beside their friend and not some stranger wearing his face. "No," he said finally, "that's the honest answer. It doesn't scare me. I know it probably should. I know what it means if I keep doing this 5 more times and end up with 5 more of whatever this is. But when I try to actually feel scared about it, there's just nothing there anymore. It's like reaching for a muscle that's gone numb." Hermione's jaw tightened, but she didn't say anything critical, not yet. Instead, she said, "Then we watch for you. All right, if you can't feel when something's wrong, we will. That's what we're here for." "I know," Harry said, and for the first time since the ring had cracked open on that stone, something in his chest loosened slightly, some small human thing that had nothing to do with power at all. "I'm counting on it." Behind them, miles south in a manor house full of men and women scrambling to explain a failure they didn't yet fully understand, Fenrir Greyback would eventually free himself from the ropes, drag his 4 humiliated companions upright, and make the long, dreading walk back toward the one man in Britain he was more afraid of than any full moon. And far beyond him, in that same manner, Lord Voldemort sat alone in a darkened room with his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, running the same question through his mind again and again like a stone worn smooth by water. Something left the ring and went somewhere. Where did it go? He did not know yet. But he had built an empire and buried 6 pieces of his own soul across half of Britain on the strength of one simple, unbending principle, that any question worth asking was a question he would eventually answer, no matter what it cost, no matter who had to die to give him the answer. He had no idea, not yet, that the answer was already walking through a forest 300 miles north of him, getting stronger with every mile. Chapter 2: The Locket's Truth. Mundungus Fletcher had the kind of face that looked permanently guilty even when he wasn't doing anything wrong, which made it very hard to tell. In the split second before Creature's bony fingers closed around his collar, in a dingy little cellar outside Budleigh Babberton, whether he was about to lie or actually tell the truth for once. He told the truth. Mostly because Creature had him by the throat and was making a series of increasingly specific threats involving what happened to house elves who'd stolen from the Black family and then compounded the crime by stealing from the Black family's actual heir. And Mundungus, whatever else could be said about him, was not a stupid man when the alternative to talking was strangulation. The Ministry Witch took it, he wheezed, when Creature finally allowed him enough air to speak. The toad-faced one, Umbridge. She saw it in the market, thought it looked important, official-like, took it off me for nothing, practically robbery. That's what it was, robbing an honest tradesman. You stole it from a dead man's house, Harry said flatly, from where he was standing with his arms crossed by the cellar door. There's no honest tradesman in this story, dung. Semantics, Mundungus muttered, and then flinched violently as Creature's grip tightened again. They let him go eventually, mostly because there wasn't much more use squeezing him, and Harry spent the walk back to the tent turning the information over the way he'd once turned over homework problems. Except now there was no professor to check his answer against, and getting it wrong meant someone could die. Umbridge, Ron said when Harry laid it out for them that evening, the fire burning low, rain drumming steadily on the tent canvas outside. Of course it's Umbridge. Of course the universe would decide that the woman who made us right in our own blood should also be the one guarding a piece of Voldemort's soul. She won't know what it is, Hermione said. She'll just think it's, I don't know, a status symbol, something that makes her look important. Does it matter what she thinks it is? Ron said. She's wearing it at the Ministry, which is currently run by Death Eaters and staffed by people whose entire job is arresting Muggleborns for the crime of existing. Harry was quiet for a moment, watching the fire. 6 months ago, the idea of walking back into the Ministry of Magic, the place where he'd been dragged in front of a full disciplinary hearing at 15, the place where he'd fought for his life among crashing prophecy shelves at 16, would have sat in his stomach like a stone. He waited for that stone to show up now, some faint echo of dread, and found instead only a kind of clean, forward-moving purpose, the same flat certainty he'd felt facing down Greyback in the woods. We go in, he said, same as before. Polyjuice, disguises, get in, get the locket, get out. That plan didn't exactly cover itself in glory last time we tried something like it, Hermione pointed out. We barely escaped the Department of Mysteries. That was different, Harry looked up. That was a trap, this isn't. Umbridge doesn't know what she's got, and nobody's expecting us, because nobody in their right mind would think we'd walk straight back into the belly of the beast twice. Which is either brilliant, Ron said, or exactly the kind of thing that gets written on a gravestone. Could be both, Harry said, and there was something almost like humor in it, dry and unbothered. And Hermione looked at him for a long moment before she went to fetch 3 hairs' worth of stolen Ministry disguise from the little bag of ingredients they'd been carrying since Grimmauld Place, because arguing him out of it clearly wasn't going to work. And because, though she didn't say this part out loud, some small, honest part of her wanted to see what he'd do now, that he genuinely believed nothing in that building could touch him. The Ministry of Magic, 3 days later, smelled the way it always smelled, parchment and floor polish and something colder underneath, an institutional smell that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with bureaucracy. And Harry walked through the atrium wearing the borrowed face of a man named Reg Cattermole, feeling nothing at all where the fear should have lived. The new fountain statue dominated the center of the hall, a witch and wizard seated on ornate thrones, and beneath them, twisted into positions of grotesque subservience, a goblin and a centaur, and unmistakably, a squat, ugly-faced muggle, all supporting the wizard's weight on their backs. Magic Ismite ran the inscription beneath it in gold letters, and Harry looked at it for exactly as long as it took to feel his jaw tighten, and then he kept walking, because rage wasn't the same as fear, and he'd found, in the last few weeks, that he'd lost his taste for wasting either. Hermione, wearing the disguise of a heavyset ministry witch, kept close to his shoulder, her voice low. Level 1. Umbridge's office is meant to be near the courtrooms. She's chairing the Muggle-born Registration Commission today. Mafalda Hopkirk's badge should get us through most doors without questions. And Ron, splitting off to find Runcorn's actual desk, like we planned. He'll cover for you if anyone comes looking for the real one. They separated at the lifts. Harry Reg Cattermole, according to the badge pinned lopsided to his borrowed robes, rode down alone into the lower levels, past the department signs, past witches and wizards who didn't look at him twice because a nervous, hunted-looking man in ministry robes was exactly what the Ministry of Magic looked like these days, an entire building full of people trying not to be noticed by the wrong person. He found Courtroom 10 by following the low hum of frightened voices, and he stopped just outside the door, one hand on the frame, and made himself listen for a moment before going in. "And you claim your grandmother was a witch, is that correct, Mrs. Cattermole?" Umbridge's voice, syrupy and precise, carried easily through the heavy door. "Yet you carry no wand of registered lineage, no confirmed magical education, no. I've told you I don't understand what's happened to my papers. They were in perfect order last. Papers can be forged, Mrs. Cattermole. That is rather the point of requiring an interview." Harry pushed the door open. The courtroom was smaller than the one he remembered from his own hearing, dimmer, colder, and at its center stood a thin, terrified woman he assumed was the real Mrs. Cattermole, wife of the man whose face he was currently wearing, flanked by two Dementors whose hooded presence should have dropped the temperature of the room 10 degrees and made every human heart in it stutter with cold, creeping despair. Harry felt nothing from them at all, not even a chill. Behind the raised bench, Dolores Umbridge sat exactly as he remembered her. Pink cardigan, black velvet bow, small pursed mouth arranged into an expression of professional sorrow that fooled absolutely no one who'd ever actually spoken to her, and around her throat, gleaming faintly gold against the pink wool, hung Salazar Slytherin's locket. There it is, Harry thought, and felt something settle into place inside him, clean and cold as a lock turning. "Mr. Cattermole, is it?" Umbridge said, glancing up with mild irritation. "This hearing is not open to spectators. If you have business with the commission, take a seat and wait your turn." Harry didn't sit down. "I do have business," he said. "I'd like this hearing ended. Now, and I'd like Mrs. Cattermole released, and I'd like everyone else on today's docket released as well, and I'd like your commission to stop pretending that a family register is the same thing as a soul." The silence that followed had a texture to it, thick and disbelieving. One of the two ministry officials seated beside Umbridge actually laughed, a short, incredulous bark, before catching himself. "I beg your pardon." Umbridge said very softly, which from her was always the warning sign that came right before something unpleasant. "You heard me. Mr. Cattermole, I don't know what's come over you, but you are speaking to the head of the Muggle-born Registration Commission, and if you value your employment, I don't work here." Harry reached up and pulled the badge from his robes, tossing it onto the polished floor between them, and behind him he heard the office door click shut on its own, not his doing, though it would look that way, a small piece of wandless magic he hadn't even consciously reached for, the same instinct that had turned aside Greyback's curse in the forest weeks ago. "I've never worked here, and you're about to give me back what you stole." Understanding dawned on Umbridge's face at almost the exact same moment two more ministry officials near the door recognized, beneath the borrowed features of Reg Cattermole, the particular set of a jaw and the particular color of a pair of eyes that half of magical Britain had been trained to fear or worship for the better part of 2 decades. "Potter," one of them breathed. Everything happened very fast after that, and none of it happened the way Harry's captors expected. Umbridge's wand was up first, snapping out a stunner with the reflexes of a woman who'd survived several regime changes by never once being caught unprepared, and Harry didn't even bother raising his own wand. His hand simply came up, palm out, the same wandless deflection he'd used against Greyback, and the stunner unraveled a foot from his chest like smoke hitting a fan. "That's not possible," Umbridge said, in a voice that had lost its syrup entirely. "You keep saying that," Harry said. "It keeps being true anyway." The two officials went for their wands next, and Harry moved through their spells the way he'd moved through the Snatchers, not dodging, redirecting, each curse meeting his own wand's arc and simply failing to survive the encounter. And within 4 seconds, both men were on the floor, one stunned and one bound in the same rope conjuration he'd used on Greyback, and the two Dementors, sensing chaos and blood in the water, began drifting toward the ceiling and toward Harry both at once. He turned to face them and felt the old cold start to creep in at the edges of the room, the temperature dropping, the light guttering, And then, for the first time in his life, he simply didn't respond to it. No memory of his mother's screaming rose up out of some buried well inside him. No despair. Just two cloaked, faceless things drifting closer, and a boy who looked at them the way you'd look at whether you'd already decided not to let ruin your day. Expecto patronum, he said anyway, mostly out of habit, and the stag burst from his wand in a blaze of silver light that sent both Dementors shrieking backward through the courtroom wall as though it were made of paper. Mrs. Cattermole had gone very still, watching all of this with an expression somewhere between terror and dawning, desperate hope. "You're free to go," Harry told her. "All of you on today's list. Where's the docket kept?" In her office through there, Mrs. Cattermole stammered, pointing at a side door, still staring at him like she couldn't decide if he was a rescuer or a second disaster arriving hard on the heels of the first. Harry crossed to Umbridge, who had backed herself against the bench, wand still raised but trembling now, and he didn't feel a flicker of the old instinctive discomfort he used to feel just being in a room with her. "The locket," he said. "Now, this is ministry property," Umbridge said, and even now cornered and outmatched, there was a defiant, mulish set to her jaw that Harry almost respected, in the abstract way you respect stubbornness in general even when you despise the person showing it. "I confiscated it fairly from. You stole it from a thief who stole it from a dead man's house, and before that it belonged to someone whose name would make you wet yourself if you understood what you were wearing." Harry held out his hand. Last chance, she didn't move fast enough. Harry's wand flicked, wordless, and the locket's chain simply came apart at the clasp, the gold ornament dropping into his open palm with a small, satisfying weight, warm from being worn against skin, cold underneath that warmth in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Behind him, the courtroom door burst open, and 4 more Ministry security wizards spilled in, wands raised, shouting things that mostly amounted to "don't move" and "hands where I can see them." Harry didn't move his hands where they could see them. He turned to face all 4 of them at once, locket now safely pocketed, and something in his stance, unhurried, unafraid, utterly certain, made 2 of the 4 hesitate before they'd even finished raising their wands. "You should let everyone in this room walk out," Harry said. "All the people scheduled for hearings today. Release them, tear up the paperwork, and I'll be on my way, and none of you have to explain to your superiors how badly this went for you." "You're outnumbered, Potter," said the lead security wizard, though his voice wagered less confidence than his words did. "I really don't think I am," Harry said, and meant it so completely that the man's certainty cracked visibly down the middle. What followed wasn't really a fight so much as a demonstration. Harry disarmed the first 2 before they'd finished their incantations, sent the third crashing into a wall with a banishing charm delivered almost gently, and had the 4th bound and gagged inside 8 seconds, and through all of it his heart rate never climbed past what it had been standing in a queue at Gringotts. Mrs. Cattermole watched with her hand pressed over her mouth. Umbridge watched with an expression that had finally, fully curdled into fear. "Open the office," Harry told her. "The dockets, all of them, not just today's." She led him through, wand tip trembling, and inside a filing room stacked floor to ceiling with folders that Harry realized, with a slow, cold anger, represented every single family the commission had dragged in this month alone. He found Ron already there, having abandoned his own disguise entirely. Apparently deciding subtlety was no longer the order of the day, stuffing folders into an enlarged bag with the enthusiastic recklessness of a man throwing a party in the middle of a disaster. "Figured you'd get here eventually," Ron said, grinning despite everything, sweat on his brow. "You destroy the courtroom yet? Bits of it. Brilliant. Hermione's already got half the holding cells open on this floor. Turns out most of them are just Muggle-borns waiting for their hearings. No actual guards to speak of, because nobody expected anyone to be stupid enough to break people out. I'll take that as a compliment." They moved fast after that, Hermione rejoining them at a run, disguise abandoned, dragging 2 frightened witches and an elderly wizard by the sleeve, more people trailing behind them from the cells she'd already cleared, and the alarm, when it finally went up across the ministry, chased them not toward the exits, which had been sealed, but up, floor by floor, toward the atrium and the fireplaces that offered the only way out. Harry didn't run from the wizards who chased them. He turned to face each wave as it came, buying seconds, minutes, holding corridors alone while Ron and Hermione hurried the freed prisoners toward the lifts. And every single ministry official who came around a corner expecting an easy arrest instead found a 17-year-old boy standing utterly still, utterly unafraid, disarming them with an economy of motion that felt less like dueling and more like inevitability. By the time they reached the atrium, Harry last, walking backward the final stretch just to make sure nothing followed too closely, The statue of magic is might looming grotesquely overhead. Word had already begun to spread through the building in the particular electric way rumors do when something genuinely extraordinary has happened. Witches and wizards leaned out of office doors. A junior clerk actually applauded, once, before an older colleague grabbed his arm and yanked him back inside. Everyone through the fireplaces, Harry called to the small crowd of freed prisoners, 9 of them now, blinking and disbelieving in the green firelight. Go home, go somewhere safe, don't come back here. Tell people what happened if you want to. I don't care anymore who knows it was me. You're Harry Potter, said the elderly wizard, staring at him with something like awe. They said you were in hiding. They said a lot of things, Harry said. Go on, get out of here. One by one they vanished into green fire, and then it was just the 3 of them, standing amid a ministry atrium full of stunned faces and half-drawn wands that nobody quite dared to actually use. And Harry looked around at all of it, the golden fountain, the polished floor, the frightened, furious officials keeping their distance, and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, something that wasn't quite triumph, but was close enough to it that he let himself enjoy it for exactly 3 seconds before grabbing Ron's arm and Hermione's hand, and disapparating them all out of the single most dangerous building in magical Britain. They reappeared in a wood 2 counties away, breathless, and Ron immediately doubled over laughing in the particular, unhinged way people laugh after surviving something they shouldn't have. Did you see their faces? He gasped. Did you see Umbridge's face when the locket just popped off like that? We need to move, Hermione said, though she was smiling too, despite herself, despite everything, adrenaline still bright in her cheeks. They'll trace the apparition eventually, we can't stay. We'll move, Harry said. But first he pulled the locket from his pocket, and it lay heavy and gleaming in his palm, warm from being carried against Umbridge's neck and cold underneath, that same wrong-feeling chill he remembered from the ring. Let's finish it. They found a clearing an hour's walk further on, and this time nobody argued about waiting, nobody delayed. Hermione unwrapped the sword. Ron took a careful step back, further this time than he had with the ring, having learned something from the last time. Harry set the locket on a flat stone, and for a moment before he raised the sword, it seemed to shudder on its own, and a thin, cold voice slid out of the metal, hissing directly into his mind. I have seen your heart, and it is mine, and Harry felt nothing but a faint, distant contempt for the theatrics of it. You're not very good at this, he told the locket out loud, which made Ron laugh despite the tension, and then he brought the sword down. The scream this time was quieter than the rings had been, more resigned, and the unmaking that followed hit Harry differently too. Not a violent unzipping this time, but something almost gentle, a door opening rather than being kicked in, and the visions that poured through it were sharper, more deliberate, as though whatever piece of Voldemort's soul lived in this fragment had been waiting, expecting this, and had decided to hand over its inheritance rather than have it torn away. He saw a young man, 16, 17, prefect's badge gleaming, standing in an empty classroom late at night, practicing something in front of a mirror that had nothing to do with spells at all. The careful, deliberate construction of walls inside his own mind, brick by brick, memory by memory, sealing away everything that could be used against him, every fear, every doubt, every flicker of the orphanage and the cupboard and the years before anyone called him special. Harry watched that boy build a fortress inside his own skull with the same patient, obsessive precision he'd bring to any other kind of mastery, and he understood, watching it, that this had never been a spell learned from a book. This had been armor forged one deliberate decision at a time, until the mind behind those eyes became genuinely unreadable to anyone, Dumbledore included, who tried to look inside it without permission. And then, layered beneath that, the other side of the same coin. That same young man standing over another student, wand not even raised, simply looking, and the other boy's eyes going glassy and distant as his most private thoughts, his most guarded secrets, unspooled themselves without resistance, offered up like a confession to a priest who had never once believed in mercy. Harry came back to himself on his knees again, though this time the transition was smoother, less like being torn apart and more like surfacing from very deep water. Ron and Hermione were crouched on either side of him, and this time neither of them looked quite as frightened as they had the first time, more braced for it, more ready. Okay, Hermione asked. Yeah, Harry sat back. He could feel it already, the new thing settling into place inside his skull, and it didn't feel like a weapon exactly. It felt like a room he'd just discovered inside his own house, when he'd been walking past his entire life without knowing it was there. I think I just got a clumency, and the other half of it too. The other half, legilimency. He looked at Ron, who immediately took a step back with his hands half raised, half joking, half not. Don't, Ron said. Don't you dare go rooting around in my head. I've got things in there I'd rather you never. I'm not going to read your mind, Ron. You say that now, I mean it. I can feel it's not automatic. I have to choose to do it. It's not like it's just leaking out of everyone into my brain all the time. Harry frowned, testing the new sense the way he'd test a muscle he'd never used before, and found that he could, if he wanted to, feel the faint edges of Ron's mind. Not thoughts, not words, just the general shape of a mood, worry laced through with residual excitement, and he pulled back from it deliberately, the way you'd pull your hand back from a hot stove out of courtesy rather than necessity. I can control it. That's the whole point of what I just saw. He built walls first, learned to keep people out before he ever learned to get in. That's actually kind of impressive as far as evil goes, Ron admitted. It's efficient, Hermione said. That's what it's always been with him. Everything he does is built for maximum control. She was watching Harry very closely, in the assessing way she looked at problems she hadn't fully solved yet. What are you going to do with it? Harry looked down at the ruined locket, its face bent and blackened now, whatever had lived inside it finally completely gone. I'm going to use it, he said, properly, not for parlor tricks. There are people all over that ministry who know things, who's really loyal, who's just scared, where they're keeping people, what they're planning next. And I'm not going to sit in a tent hiding from it anymore when I could actually go find out. Harry, Hermione said carefully, that's not a small thing you're describing. Walking into someone's mind without permission, it's an invasion, even against people working for him. I know what it is. He met her eyes, steady, no apology in it. I'm not going to pretend I'm sorry about using it on the people helping him drag families out of their homes. I used to think being the good guy meant fighting fair even when the other side didn't. I don't think that anymore. I think it just means choosing who you use it on, and why, and I've made my choice. Hermione didn't have an immediate answer for that, and Ron, for once, didn't fill the silence with a joke. They sat with it for a while, the fire crackling low, and none of them said the thing that was, by now, obvious to all three of them, that the boy sitting across the fire from them was no longer simply Harry, plus some new tricks. He was becoming something that hadn't existed in the world before, built out of pieces of the most dangerous wizard alive, and somehow, still, unmistakably himself underneath it, and none of them yet knew whether that combination would end in victory or in something far worse. News of what had happened in the Ministry atrium reached Malfoy Manor within the hour, carried by a badly shaken Yaxley, whose robes were still singed at the hem from a banishing charm he'd taken personally, and Voldemort received the report standing perfectly still in the center of the drawing room, hands folded behind his back, while Yaxley stammered through an account that grew less coherent the longer his master's silence stretched. Walked in alone, my lord, disguised, and within minutes he'd freed 9 prisoners, disarmed a dozen trained security officers, driven off 2 Dementors with barely a flick of his wand, and Umbridge says, my lord, Umbridge says he took something from her. Some locket she'd confiscated months ago. She couldn't say why she'd even kept it, only that Potter seemed to know exactly where it was and exactly what it. He stopped talking, because Voldemort's expression had changed, and every Death Eater in that manor had learned, through hard experience, that change was the single most dangerous thing they would ever witness. A locket, Voldemort said softly. Yes, my lord. He turned away from Yaxley entirely, walking slowly to the tall windows overlooking the manor's dark gardens, and behind his ribs, in the place where a second Horcrux had lived quietly and invisibly for years, he felt the same wrenching, sideways sensation he'd felt when the ring broke, not destruction but transfer, and this time he did not simply feel surprised by it. This time, standing alone at that window with his back to the room, Lord Voldemort felt something close to real fear for the first time in decades, though he would have died before admitting the word applied to him. 2, he thought, 2 now, taken and given elsewhere, and I still do not know where they have gone. He knew, with the cold, methodical clarity that had built an empire out of murder and fear, that this could not be coincidence. Potter had not simply destroyed the ring by luck, and stumbled onto the locket by a second stroke of the same luck. Someone, something, was guiding him toward these objects with an accuracy that suggested knowledge no 17-year-old boy should possess. Dumbledore, he thought, and the old, familiar hatred settled over the fear like a comforting blanket, because hatred, unlike fear, was something Voldemort knew exactly what to do with. Even dead, you're still meddling. Severus, he said, without turning around. Snape, who had been standing near the door through the entire exchange with an expression of studied, careful blankness, stepped forward. My lord, you are headmaster of Hogwarts. You have access to every record that old fool ever kept, every research project, every obscure text in that library. Voldemort turned now, and his red eyes fixed on Snape with an intensity that would have made a lesser man's knees buckle. I want to know what happens when a Horcrux is destroyed. Not the destruction itself, I understand that well enough. I want to know whether it is possible, in the moment an anchor breaks, for what it contains to travel somewhere, to be received. Snape's face did not change, but something behind his eyes, something only a legilimens of Voldemort's own caliber might have caught, if he'd been looking for it rather than absorbed in his own fury, flickered just once, with a thought he buried before it could rise fully to the surface. He doesn't understand yet. He doesn't understand what he's built. I will search the library thoroughly, my lord, Snape said aloud, his voice perfectly even. Though I would caution against assuming too much from limited information. It may simply be that the destruction disperses residual magic in ways that feel, to you, like loss taking a direction. Grief has a way of imagining agency where there is none. Do not lecture me on grief, Severus. Voldemort's voice had gone very quiet again, which was, as always, the more dangerous register. I am not grieving, I am calculating. And what I am calculating is this: Potter has destroyed 2 of my anchors in the space of a month, after years of doing nothing at all, which suggests either that he has finally found competent guidance, or that something is happening to him that he does not yet fully understand either. Both possibilities require the same response, which is, my lord, find him. Faster and with more force than we have been using. Voldemort's gaze swept the room, landing on Bellatrix, who straightened instantly, eager as always for any task he set her. Bellatrix, I want every Snatcher crew in the country doubled, and I want the boy's known associates, the Weasleys, the Order remnants, anyone who has ever sheltered him, watched, questioned, and if necessary made to talk. I do not care how. With pleasure, my lord, Bellatrix breathed, and Severus. Voldemort's attention returned to Snape, who had gone very still by the door. You will keep the school under tighter control. If there is even a whisper that Potter has been near Hogwarts, or that anyone connected to the school knows something they should not, I want it brought to me immediately. Are we understood? Perfectly, my lord. Voldemort dismissed them with a wave of one long, pale hand, and the room emptied slowly, Death Eaters filing out with the particular hurried quiet of people who very much wanted to be somewhere else, until only Snape remained by the door, watching his master turn back to the dark window, alone with a fear he would never name aloud. Snape left the manor an hour later, and on the long walk back to the gates where he could apparate without wards flagging his exact point of departure, he allowed himself, for exactly as long as it took to cross the gravel drive, to think a single unguarded thought, wrapped in a clumency so tight that even a legilimens as skilled as the one he now served could never have caught it passing through his mind. 2 down, 5 left, and he still thinks I am the one he needs to be afraid of finding answers. He did not smile. Snape had not genuinely smiled in longer than he could remember, and would not have permitted himself the indulgence even now, alone on a dark road with no one to see it. But something in his chest, cold and old, and buried under 17 years of careful, deliberate self-denial, loosened very slightly, and he walked the rest of the way to the gates a fraction lighter than he had walked toward them. Chapter 3, Gringotts and the Goblin's Price. Harry sat very still with his eyes closed, and Ron and Hermione sat very still watching him, and none of them moved for almost 10 minutes because what Harry was doing was, by any sane standard, a terrible idea, and all 3 of them knew it. You feel anything yet? Ron asked, for the 3rd time in a whisper that suggested whispering somehow made the question less irritating. SHH. He wasn't looking for Voldemort's mind exactly. That connection had always worked the other direction, unwanted and uncontrollable, dreams and visions shoving their way into his head whether he liked it or not. What he was doing now was different, deliberate, the way you'd ease a door open a careful half-inch instead of kicking it down. He'd spent 2 nights testing the new sense the locket had left him, first on Ron, gently, with permission, learning the shape and texture of a mind that trusted him completely, learning what it felt like when someone let you in versus when you forced your way through. Only once he understood the difference, really understood it, the way you understand a spell after you've cast it wrong a dozen times, and finally get the wrist motion right, had he turned that same careful attention toward the old, familiar scarrake at the edge of his own consciousness, the place where his mind and Voldemort's had always faintly touched. He found it easier than he expected. That frightened him more than anything else about the whole exercise, though he didn't say so out loud. He didn't push. He didn't try to read thoughts or steal secrets the way he'd have imagined doing this a year ago, clumsily grabbing at whatever he could reach. He simply let himself drift along the very edge of that old connection, listening the way you'd listen at a door without opening it, and what came through wasn't words, it was impressions. Anxiety cold and controlled, wrapped around a name, Bellatrix, and beneath that a flicker of something gold, ornate, familiar in the specific way objects are familiar to the people who have hidden them. And underneath even that, a single clear image that surfaced and vanished almost too fast to hold. A stone vault deep underground, goblin-carved, and within it, gleaming among towers of gold, a small cup with 2 handles, badger crest worn nearly smooth from age. Harry's eyes snapped open. "Gringotts," he said. "It's in Gringotts, Bellatrix's vault." Hermione let out a breath she'd apparently been holding the entire 10 minutes. "Did he notice you? Harry, did he feel you there?" "I don't think so." Harry rubbed at his eyes, and for the first time since the locket, the effort of using the new power had cost him something. A dull throb behind his temples, like the muscle strain after using a limb you'd forgotten you had. It felt different from before, controlled on my end. "But I'm not doing that again unless I have to. If he ever catches me actually inside there, properly inside, I don't know what he'd be able to do with that." "You just told us he's got the cup guarded in the most secure building in Wizarding Britain," Ron said. "And your response to that information is good, glad we know, never doing that again." "I said I'm not doing that again, not that we're giving up on Gringotts." "Small mercies." Ron flopped back onto his sleeping bag. "Gringotts, course it's Gringotts. Not, I don't know, a nice unguarded shed somewhere. Had to be the one place in the country actually designed to stop people exactly like us." "That's why he thinks it's safe there," Hermione said slowly, and Harry could see the machinery of her mind already turning, already several steps ahead of the conversation. "He's arrogant about it in a specific way. He trusts Goblin security completely because he's never had to rely on anyone else's protection for anything in his life, and Gringotts has never been broken into successfully. Not once, not by anyone. He'd never imagined 3 teenagers managing what nobody else has managed in 300 years. So we're the first," Harry said. "We're going to try to be the first," Hermione corrected, though there wasn't much force behind the correction, and Ron caught the shift in her tone and grinned despite himself. The particular grin he wore whenever Hermione started sounding like she was already halfway to solving the impossible thing rather than dismissing it outright. They didn't have long to sit with the problem before help arrived from an unexpected direction. Bill Weasley's owl found them 2 days later at their new camp in a stretch of coastal scrubland, carrying a short, cautious letter in Bill's careful hand. "Dean turned up at the cottage last night, half-starved, in bad shape but alive. He wasn't alone. Says there's someone with him you'll want to talk to. Come if you can, quietly." Shell Cottage sat low and white against gray Cornish cliffs, whined off the sea strong enough to make conversation outdoors a genuine effort, and Fleur met them at the door with the particular brisk efficiency of someone who had decided, the moment fugitives started arriving on her doorstep with any regularity, to simply become extremely good at hosting fugitives. "They are in the back room," she said, ushering them through with barely a glance at their exhausted, weeks-on-the-run appearance, because by now she'd stopped expecting anyone to arrive looking otherwise. "Dean is resting. The other one does not rest. He paces, it is most unsettling." The other one, when Harry pushed open the back door, turned out to be a goblin, thin even by goblin standards, with a long, cunning face and dark eyes that fixed on Harry the instant he entered, sharp with an assessment that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with calculation. "Harry Potter," the goblin said before anyone could introduce him. "I heard what you did at the Ministry. Everyone has heard. It is being told in 3 different versions already, each more impossible than the last. And you are Griffook." He said it the way you'd say a name that had earned respect and never received it. "I worked in the vaults for Gringotts for over 200 years, until they decided a goblin's loyalty to wizards was worth less than the loyalty they demanded from him, and locked me in a cellar at Malfoy Manor for the crime of once handling a withdrawal for the wrong family." "He means my family," Ron said quietly. "He'd know things about our vault, is what he means." "I know things about every vault," Griffook said, with the faint, dangerous pride of someone who had spent 2 centuries being underestimated, "including, I understand, the one you are interested in, Bellatrix Lestrange's." Nobody had told him that. Harry felt Hermione go still beside him. "How do you know that?" Harry asked. "Because Dean Thomas talks in his sleep about very little else besides being afraid, and because you would not have risked coming here into Order territory for a passing chat." Griffook's smile showed too many small, sharp teeth. "I am not a fool, Mr. Potter. I know what you are looking for roughly. I do not need to know exactly what it is to know that it matters to you enough to justify enormous risk, and I know Gringotts. I know it better than any wizard alive, and better than most goblins currently employed there, because I spent 200 years learning its secrets, and they threw me away regardless. So you'll help us." "I will help you," Griffook agreed, "for a price." Gold, Ron said immediately. Whatever's left in our vaults, take it, we don't, not gold. Griffook's expression flattened with something like contempt quickly banked. Gold is easy for wizards to offer because it costs them nothing they value. I want the sword. The room went quiet. Hermione's hand drifted, almost unconsciously, toward the strap across her shoulder where the sword of Gryffindor hung, wrapped as always in its protective cloth. That's not, Harry started. I know what it is worth to you. Godric Gryffindor's blade, the only weapon in Britain that can kill a basilisk, that draws whatever it needs to draw. I also know, Griffook said, leaning forward, his dark eyes bright with an old banked fury that Harry recognized instantly, because he'd seen its shape before in Creature, in Dobby, in every creature who'd spent a lifetime being told their worth was conditional, that it was made by goblins. Forged by goblin hands in a goblin workshop, by a craftsman whose name history has erased because history is written by wizards, for wizards about wizards. And it has spent 500 years being worn by wizards, passed down, sold, displayed, treated as property that belongs to whoever currently holds it, when by every law goblins have ever recognized, a thing belongs forever to the one who made it. Ownership does not transfer with a sale. It transfers with blood or not at all. That's an actual difference between us, Hermione said slowly, and Harry could hear the gears of her mind engaging with the problem the way they always did, curiosity overtaking caution. Goblin-made objects. You don't believe in wizarding property law for them at all. We have never been asked to believe in a law that was written specifically to justify taking things from us, Griffook said. So we do not believe in it. We tolerate it because the alternative to tolerating it has, historically, ended in goblin corpses. But I do not forget, and I do not forgive, and if you want my help getting into that vault, you will give me the sword when the vault is opened, before you leave with whatever else you are looking for. Harry looked at Hermione, and Hermione looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a long moment, because both of them understood, without needing to say it, exactly how dangerous this bargain was. The sword was likely the only weapon capable of destroying a Horcrux besides basilisk venom itself, and they had, potentially, 4 more of the things left to find and destroy after this one. After the vault, Harry said finally. After we're out, not before. And I want your word, actual goblin word, whatever that means to you, that you won't turn on us once we're inside. Griffook studied him for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, some small recalibration. You are the first wizard who has ever negotiated with me as though my word were worth anything at all, he said. Very well, Harry Potter, you will have your entry, and I will have my sword when the moment comes, whether you have decided you are ready to give it to me or not. It wasn't quite a promise of good faith, and all 3 of them knew it, but it was the only deal on offer, and they didn't have the luxury of waiting for a better one. Diagon Alley, when they finally walked its length disguised beyond recognition, Hermione transformed by Polyjuice into a passable, terrifying Bellatrix Lestrange, black curls and hooded eyes, and all, Ron aged and darkened into an unfamiliar foreign wizard supposedly acting as her escort. Harry, beneath the invisibility cloak with Griffook riding in a basket disguised as luggage, looked wrong in ways that had nothing to do with the disguises they were wearing. Half the shop stood boarded and dark. The windows that remained open sold nothing that hadn't been approved for sale by a ministry that increasingly resembled the regime it was supposed to be protecting people from. 2 wizards in the black robes of Death Eater sympathizers loitered near the entrance to Gringotts itself, and their eyes tracked Bellatrix the moment she came into view, straightening with the particular deference reserved for people everyone was afraid of. Madame Lestrange, one of them said, bowing slightly. We weren't told you'd be, then you weren't told everything, were you? Hermione said, in a voice pitched low and cold and dripping with exactly the kind of casual cruelty Bellatrix wore like perfume, and the wizard flinched back so quickly he nearly tripped over his own robes. Ron, beside her, said nothing at all, which fit the role perfectly, since silence had never once made anyone suspicious of an intimidating stranger. Inside, the marble hall of Gringotts stretched cool and vast, goblin tellers hunched over their high desks, and Harry, invisible, silent, feeling the old familiar itch of nerves that used to precede a plan like this and finding, once again, only clean, quiet purpose in its place, kept pace at Ron's shoulder as they approached the desk where an ancient goblin named Bogrod sat processing withdrawal slips with mechanical, joyless efficiency. Griffook had warned them about Bogrod specifically. He is old and tired and has served the bank for longer than most humans live, and he does not love his employers any more than I do. But he is cautious, and cautious goblins are harder to deceive than frightened ones. Hermione slid a forged authorization scroll across the desk, copied with painstaking care, from a genuine Lestrange document Griffith had described in exacting detail from memory, and Bogrod studied it with slow, deliberate suspicion that made the seconds stretch unbearably. "This authorization," Bogrod said, "is not in your hand, Madame Lestrange. I don't personally write out every scrap of parchment my business requires," Hermione said with icy boredom. "That's what clerks are for. Even so, protocol requires." Harry, invisible beside Ron's shoulder, felt the moment tip toward disaster and made a choice that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the flat, forward-moving certainty that had lived in his chest since the ring. He leaned close to Ron's ear, whispered a single instruction, and Ron, sweating, but committed now past the point of turning back, leaned across the desk with exactly the kind of impatient menace a foreign associate of Bellatrix Lestrange would deploy against an inconvenient functionary. "Are you suggesting," Ron said, in the low, accented voice he'd been rehearsing for 2 days, "that Madame Lestrange's authority requires verification? Perhaps you would like to explain that suggestion to the Dark Lord personally. I am sure he would find the implication fascinating." Bogrod's hands, old and slow, went very still on the parchment. Whatever fear he'd spent decades learning to feel toward that particular threat won out over whatever professional caution he'd spent decades learning to feel toward forged documents, and he nodded once sharply and rose from his stool. "This way," he said. "Vault access requires the cart. Follow closely." The cart ride down into the vaults was the part Harry remembered most vividly afterward, not because anything went wrong during it, but because of how completely wrong the place itself felt the deeper they descended. Narrow stone tunnels lit by torches that burned an unnatural blue-white, the temperature dropping with every level, and somewhere below them, distant but unmistakable, the low, huffing breath of something enormous. "Dragon," Griffith said quietly from his basket, the first thing he'd said since they'd entered the bank. "Ukrainian Ironbelly, kept chained at the lowest level as final security for the oldest, deepest vaults. Bellatrix's is 1 level above it, which should be far enough that we do not have to deal with the beast directly." Should be were words Harry did not love hearing in that particular context, but there wasn't time to dwell on it, because the cart lurched, plunged, and finally screeched to a halt in front of a vault door carved with an intricate, ancient design that seemed to shift very slightly when Harry looked at it too long, as though the metal itself were breathing. Bogrod pressed his palm against the door, and it groaned open, revealing a chamber piled from floor to ceiling with gold, coins, goblets, jeweled crowns, armor stacked in careless, glittering heaps, the accumulated wealth of a family that had spent centuries acquiring things purely for the pleasure of having acquired them. "There," Griffith said, and Harry followed the line of his pointed finger to a high shelf near the back, where, nestled among a cluster of ornamental cups and bowls, sat a small golden cup with 2 handles, badger crest worn nearly smooth, exactly as he'd glimpsed it in that careful, dangerous half-second inside Voldemort's mind. "Don't touch anything," Griffith warned, as Ron, predictably, reached toward the nearest gleaming pile out of sheer instinctive greed. "This vault carries 2 curses layered together. Anything you touch will burn you, and anything you remove multiplies instantly, over and over, faster than you can move, until the room fills entirely and crushes anyone still inside it. The goblins call it the thief's death. It is considered elegant." "That's genuinely horrifying," Ron said, snatching his hand back so fast he nearly overbalanced. Harry stepped forward carefully, eyes on the cup, and felt the room's danger register clearly in his mind without the accompanying flood of adrenaline that should have come with it. A problem to be solved, nothing more, nothing less. "How do we get it without touching anything else?" "Carefully," Griffith said, with the particular unhelpfulness of someone enjoying watching wizards struggle with a problem goblins had designed specifically to be unsolvable by wizards. Hermione, still wearing Bellatrix's face, though the effect was growing steadily more distracting the longer they stood in a room full of things Bellatrix had actually stolen, was already scanning the shelves with narrowed eyes. "The flame-freezing charm on that goblet there, if we could transfer something like it onto our own hands, temporarily, we could touch the metal without triggering the burn, but we don't have time for careful," Harry said. "Ron, hand me your robe." "My what?" "Your robe, sleeve first." Ron, bewildered but past the point of arguing, shrugged out of the outer layer of his disguise robes and passed it over, and Harry wrapped it thick around his own hand, 3-4 layers of dense wool, enough that whatever burned skin might not burn cloth quite as fast, and reached, slowly, carefully, past a jeweled crown and a stack of gilded plates, toward the small golden cup on its high shelf. The moment his wrapped fingers closed around it, heat flared through the cloth, sharp and immediate, and beside the cup itself he felt, for one impossible, disorienting second, the fabric in his hand multiply, a second cup blinking into existence where there had been only one, then a third, spilling off the shelf with a metallic clatter that echoed horribly through the stone chamber. Out, out, move, Griffook was shouting, and Harry didn't argue, yanking the original cup free and turning for the door as gold began to spill and multiply around them in a rising, glittering tide, goblets doubling into goblets, coins avalanching into coins, the entire room filling with a low, ominous groan of shifting, expanding metal. They half ran, half scrambled back to the cart, gold nipping at their heels. Ron actually cried out once, a burn already blistering across his ankle where a stray coin had brushed skin, and Bogrod, wild-eyed now, sent the cart hurtling back up through the tunnels at a speed that pressed Harry hard against the seat and made his stomach lurch in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with simple physics. They were 3 levels from the surface when Griffook made his move. "The sword," he said, and his voice had changed, no longer the low, careful tone of an ally, but something sharper, colder, final. "You promised it to me the moment the vault was open." "It has been opened, Harry Potter. I want it now." "We agreed after we're out," Harry said, gripping the cup tight against his chest, feeling the cart lurch around another bend. "Not before. You agreed to your version of the bargain. I agreed to mine." Griffook was on his feet in the swaying cart now, small and quick, hand already extended toward the sword strapped across Hermione's transformed back. "Give it to me, or I scream this entire bank down around your ears before you take one more step toward the surface, and you will discover very quickly how little goblin loyalty is worth to you compared to how much it is worth to me." Ron's hand went for his wand. Harry's didn't. He simply looked at Griffook, really looked at him, the old fury behind those dark eyes, 200 years of being used and discarded by exactly the kind of people Harry was currently disguised as, and felt something that surprised him, given everything else that had happened that day. Not anger. Understanding, sharp and unwelcome. "You're right," Harry said quietly. "I did make you a promise, and I'm about to try and slide past it because it's convenient for me." "That's exactly the kind of thing every wizard you've ever worked for has done to you, isn't it?" Griffook faltered, just slightly, wrong-footed by being agreed with instead of argued against. "But I need this sword for something that matters more than I can explain to you right now, in a cart, 3 floors under Gringotts, with a dragon between us and the door," Harry went on. "And I'm not going to lie to you and pretend I'm not choosing to break my word. I'm choosing you over the sword right now in this exact moment, because I think we're going to need it again before this is over and I don't have another one. I'm sorry." "That's the truth, and you deserve the truth more than you deserve another wizard's excuse." For a moment, nobody moved. The cart rattled on through the dark, and Griffook stared at Harry with an expression that had shifted from fury into something far more complicated, surprise, and beneath the surprise, a kind of bitter, weary recognition, as though honesty was somehow worse than the lie he'd been braced to receive, because at least the lie would have confirmed everything he already believed about wizards. "Then you are no different from the rest of them," Griffook said finally, quiet and cold, "only more honest about it while you do the same thing." He didn't scream the bank down. He simply sat back, arms folded, and said nothing else for the rest of the ride, and Harry understood, watching him, that whatever alliance had existed between them had ended the instant he'd chosen the sword over his word, honesty or not, and that there would be a reckoning for it eventually. There wasn't time to dwell on that either, because the cart screeched around a final bend and came out into a wide stone chamber, and there, chained by heavy iron shackles to the floor and walls, reared the Ukrainian Ironbelly, enormous, scaled, its wings folded tight against a body the size of a house, eyes tracking the cart with slow, ancient malice. "That's not one level above it," Ron said faintly. "That's level with it. The cart takes a different route on the return," Griffook said, with no particular urgency in his voice at all, as though he found the sudden proximity of a dragon almost restful compared to the conversation they'd just had. "It should not notice us if we—" The cart's brakes shrieked, sparking against the track, and lurched to a dead stop directly beneath the dragon's lowered, curious head, and the dragon, sensing intruders in its domain with the particular stubborn territorial fury dragons never quite lose regardless of how long they've been chained, opened its jaws and unleashed a column of fire that turned the stone chamber briefly, gloriously bright. Harry didn't scream. He didn't even flinch. He simply stood up in the rocking cart, cup still clutched to his chest with one arm, and raised his wand toward the incoming flame with the same flat, unhurried certainty he'd shown Greyback in the woods and Umbridge in her courtroom. Protego Maxima, the shield that erupted around the cart, wasn't the pale, familiar shimmer he'd learned in Dumbledore's army. It came out huge and gold and solid, absorbing the dragon's fire entirely, the flames simply dying against it as though they'd struck stone, and Ron actually laughed out loud, disbelieving, half hysterical. "Get us moving," Harry shouted at Bogrod, over the dragon's furious, frustrated roar. "Now, before it tries something worse." Bogrod, terrified past the point of caution, hauled a lever and the cart lurched free of the dragon's chain's reach, hurtling up through the last stretch of tunnel toward daylight, and behind them the Ironbelly's roar chased them the whole way, echoing off stone until it finally faded into the general chaos erupting through the bank above, alarms shrieking, goblins shouting, the whole institution realizing, 3 centuries after it had last needed to, that its vaults had actually, finally been breached. They burst out through the front doors of Gringotts into blinding afternoon light, and there wasn't time to run, because the dragon, furious, unchained now that its handlers in the panic hadn't thought to resecure it, and apparently deciding that freedom mattered rather more than territory, came thundering up through the tunnels behind them and out into the open street, wings unfurling for the first time in years, sending pedestrians screaming and scattering in every direction. "On the dragon," Harry said, already moving. "On the dragon." Hermione, still Bellatrix, wig slightly askew from the sprint, stared at him like he'd suggested something genuinely insane, which, to be fair, he had. "It's leaving, it's going to fly out of here whether we're on it or not, and it's a lot faster than running, and honestly right now, I don't much fancy our chances against every Auror who's about to come through those doors." Harry grabbed her arm, then Ron's, hauling them both toward the dragon's descending, scaled flank as it scrabbled clumsily along the cobblestones, wings beating up dust and screaming shoppers. "Trust me." They scrambled up onto its back, Griffook forgotten in the chaos, leaping clear at the last second and vanishing into the crowd, his own business with them apparently concluded, and the moment all 3 of them had a grip on the ridged, leathery scales, the dragon, sensing freedom finally within reach, launched itself skyward with a lurch that nearly threw Ron clean off, up over Diagon Alley, over the rooftops of London. Climbing into open gray sky, with 3 fugitive teenagers clinging desperately to its back, and 1 small golden cup still clutched, miraculously, in Harry's white-knuckled hand. They flew like that for nearly 10 minutes, wind roaring, the city shrinking beneath them into a patchwork of rooftops and rivers, until the dragon, tiring or simply losing interest in its unwanted passengers, banked low over open water and Harry made the only sensible decision available to him. "Jump." He shouted, and all 3 of them let go at once, plunging down into a wide, cold lake with a shock of impact that drove the air from Harry's lungs and sent the cup tumbling from his grip into the murky water below. He found it again within seconds, diving down through cold green light to close his fingers around it before it could sink beyond reach, and when he broke the surface, gasping, Ron and Hermione were already swimming for the shore, laughing and coughing in roughly equal measure, adrenaline burning off into something giddy and disbelieving now that the immediate danger had passed. "We rode a dragon," Ron said, dragging himself up onto the muddy bank, soaked through, grinning like a maniac. Harry, we rode an actual dragon out of Gringotts. Nobody is ever going to believe this. This is the single best thing that has ever happened to me, and I nearly died like 4 separate times in the last 20 minutes. "Focus," Hermione said, though she was smiling too, wringing water out of Bellatrix's ruined black curls, the polyjuice already beginning to wear thin at the edges, her own features starting to bleed back through. "Harry, the cup." Harry sat on the bank, dripping, and looked down at the small golden object in his hands, warm despite the cold lake water, that same wrongness pulsing faintly beneath his fingers. "Swords on Hermione's back still," he said. "Let's finish this before anything else decides to go wrong today." Hermione unwrapped it, hands still shaking slightly from adrenaline, and passed it over, and Harry set the cup down on a flat rock at the water's edge and drove the blade through it without ceremony, without hesitation, because there wasn't room left in him for either after the day they'd had. The scream that came out of it was different from both the others, not fury, not resignation, but something that sounded almost like pride, twisted and cold, and the vision that followed hit Harry harder and faster than either previous one, images tumbling over each other in a rush he could barely keep pace with. A thin, dark-haired boy in a Hogwarts classroom, watching his professor demonstrate a complex transfiguration once, only once, and then performing it flawlessly himself before anyone else in the room had even finished taking notes. That same boy in a potions classroom, glancing at another student's cauldron for a handful of seconds, and then brewing something twice as advanced from memory alone, older now, in a library at night, teaching himself wandless magic no textbook described. Simply by watching the shape, a spell made in the air and understanding, with terrifying, effortless clarity, exactly how to reproduce it. Harry came back to himself lying flat on the muddy bank, staring up at gray sky, and felt something new settle into the architecture of his mind. Not knowledge exactly, not spells he suddenly knew he could cast, but a kind of hunger for seeing, a certainty that if he watched something done once properly, he would never need to watch it twice. Harry, Hermione's face appeared above him, upside down, water dripping from her hair onto his cheek. What did you see this time? I think, Harry said slowly, sitting up, that if either of you ever cast a spell in front of me again, I'm going to be able to do it too, just from watching. Ron stared at him. That's actually terrifying. That's the single most unfair magical ability I've ever heard of. Try me, Harry said, and Ron, despite everything, despite the exhaustion and the cold, and the fact that they'd just stolen from and ridden a dragon out of the most secure bank in Britain, couldn't resist grinning as he raised his wand and on a whim cast a small, obscure charm he'd learned from George years ago involving turning water briefly into pudding. Something silly and specific that Harry had absolutely no reason to already know. Harry raised his own wand a half-second later, watched the shape of the movement replay itself in his mind with perfect clarity, and turned a puddle of lake water into a passable, if slightly gritty, portion of chocolate pudding. Oh, that's so unfair, Ron said, and even Hermione, despite her exhaustion and her lingering worry about everything this new power might mean, laughed out loud at the absurdity of it, the three of them sitting soaked and filthy on a muddy lakeshore in the fading afternoon light, having just done something no one in 300 years had managed, alive together, and for one brief, unguarded moment, genuinely happy. Voldemort visited the vault himself 2 hours later. He rarely went to Gringotts in person anymore. There were servants for such errands, functionaries who could confirm an anchor's safety without requiring his own presence. But the wrenching, sideways sensation of a third Horcrux's destruction had struck him mid-sentence during a meeting with the Carrows, sharper and more violent than either previous loss, and something in the specific violence of it had driven him, for the first time in years, to see the damage with his own eyes rather than trust a report. He arrived at the bank to find it in uproar, goblins shouting, gold spilled and multiplied across the marble floor in glittering, useless heaps, a shattered vault door hanging open on a chamber Bograd, weeping and terrified, could only describe in fragments before Voldemort silenced him with a single, contemptuous flick of his wand that left the old goblin twitching on the floor. He descended to the vault alone. He stood in the doorway of the Lestrange chamber, surrounded by mountains of gold that had multiplied themselves into a useless, glittering excess, and stared at the empty shelf where a small golden cup had sat, hidden among decoys, safe behind 2 layered curses and a dragon, and 3 centuries of unbroken security, for longer than most of the wizards currently cowering upstairs had been alive. For a long moment he did not move at all. Then very quietly he began to laugh, a low, humorless sound that carried none of warmth, and every goblin and Death Eater within earshot who heard it felt their blood run cold, because Lord Voldemort laughing like that was infinitely worse than Lord Voldemort screaming. "Bring me Bellatrix," he said, when he finally stopped, "and bring me every account of exactly how this happened, from every witness who saw anything at all. And someone find that thrice-cursed goblin who let them in, Bograd, was it? Bring him to me too, once he's woken." He climbed back up through the ruined vault levels alone, past the empty dragon chains, out into the marble hall where terrified goblins parted before him like water, and by the time he reached the surface, his fury had cooled into something colder and infinitely more dangerous, the calm, methodical fury of a man rebuilding a strategy from the ground up. 3, he thought, standing in the wrecked entrance hall of the one institution in Britain he had genuinely believed unbreakable. 3 gone now, and whatever is receiving them is growing stronger with everyone he takes. He thought briefly of the diadem hidden in the one place he had always been certain no one would think to look, and felt, for the first time in his very long, very careful life, the unfamiliar itch of a man checking that his last locked door was still, in fact, locked. Chapter 4, The Diadem and the Battle begins. The room of requirement had a way of making you feel very small, and Harry, standing at the top of a staircase built from broken furniture and forgotten treasures that stretched up into shadow further than any single room should reasonably go, felt smaller than he had in weeks. "How does anyone find anything in here?" Ron muttered, kicking aside a birdcage that had rusted shut around the skeleton of something long dead. "It's not a room, it's a civilization." "That's rather the point," Hermione said, moving carefully between towering stacks of discarded objects, wand raised, casting a soft, revealing charm every few steps. "Generations of students have been hiding things they didn't want found." Voldemort would have known that from his own time here. He wouldn't have picked somewhere obvious. He'd have picked somewhere that was already full of hidden things, so his hidden thing could hide among all the others. Harry wasn't listening quite as closely as he should have been. He was standing very still at the top of the staircase, eyes half closed, letting the strange new instinct the cup had given him stretch and settle through his mind. Not memory this time, not vision, just a kind of restless, patient awareness, like a compass needle that hadn't found north yet but knew with total certainty that north existed somewhere nearby. "This way," he said, and started down a narrow aisle between a broken wardrobe and a stack of moth-eaten tapestries, not entirely sure how he knew, only that he did. They found it 40 minutes later, perched at a careless angle atop a marble bust of a bearded wizard who'd clearly been considered important enough once to warrant a statue, and unimportant enough since to be buried under 3 centuries of student junk. A slim, delicate tiara, small blue stones set along its band, so unassuming that Harry understood immediately why it had survived undiscovered for as long as it had. It looked like the kind of thing you'd find at the bottom of a dressing-up box, not the kind of thing that housed a fragment of the most dangerous soul in Britain. Ravenclaw's diadem, Hermione breathed, reaching for it with the same careful, reverent hesitation she'd have shown a rare book. Wit beyond measure is man's greatest treasure. I've read about it, it was lost for centuries. Nobody was even sure it still existed. He found it, Harry said. Of course he did. He'd have wanted it specifically because everyone else had given up looking. He reached past her and lifted it off the bust himself, and the moment his fingers closed around the cold metal band, he felt the old, low thrum start up again beneath his skin, that particular chill of wrongness he'd learned to recognize as clearly as he recognized his own heartbeat now. "Let's not do this here," Hermione said, glancing around at the towering, precarious stacks surrounding them on every side. "If this goes anything like the ring did, if you scream, if something happens to the room around us." She didn't get to finish the thought, because that was the exact moment the door at the far end of the room of requirement banged open, and 3 figures came stumbling through it, wands raised, breathing hard, and Harry recognized all 3 before they'd finished crossing the threshold. Draco Malfoy looked terrible. Thinner than Harry remembered, hollow around the eyes in a way that had nothing to do with the dim lighting, his wand hand trembling slightly even as he kept it raised and pointed. Behind him came Vincent Crabbe, bulkier than ever but with a wild, unfocused look that made Harry's skin prickle with warning, and Gregory Goyle, silent as always, hanging back a half step like he was waiting to be told what to feel about any of this. "Potter," Draco said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word, exhaustion and old fear, and something else underneath it that Harry, with his new and unwelcome fluency in the shapes minds made when they were breaking, recognized almost immediately as desperation. "I knew it, I knew you'd come back here eventually. Draco." Harry didn't lower his own wand, but he didn't raise it further either. "You look like you haven't slept in a month." "Don't." Draco's wand hand jerked just slightly. "Don't pretend you care how I look. You're the reason everything's. You're the reason my family's disgraced. You're the reason my mother cries every night thinking nobody hears her. You're the reason the Dark Lord's been in our house for a year, using it like his own personal." He stopped, breathing hard, and something in his composure fractured further. "I have to bring you to him. Do you understand that? I don't have a choice anymore. If I don't, he'll kill my parents, and I think some part of me almost wants him to, at this point, just so it's over." "Crabbe," Harry said quietly, cutting through it, because something about the way Vincent Crabbe was standing had set off every alarm bell the last 3 years of survival had taught him to trust. "What's in your bag?" Crabbe's grin was wrong. Too wide, too eager, and his eyes had a feverish, hungry brightness that had nothing to do with the diadem, or with Draco's desperate bargaining, and everything to do with something Harry recognized, with a cold lurch, from old stories Ron had told him about his older brother's schoolyard legends, a spell whispered about in corners, powerful and uncontrollable and utterly, catastrophically illegal to attempt without training. "Something that's going to make me famous," Crabbe said, and pulled his wand up with a shout of descendo that sent an entire tower of forgotten furniture crashing down between them and the door, and in the same breath, before anyone could react, he raised his wand a second time and roared a word that turned Harry's blood to ice. "Fiendfire." Fire erupted from his wand tip, not ordinary fire, not even the controlled, contained flame of a proper spell, but something alive, something that reared up in the shape of a serpent thick as a tree trunk, hissing and roaring as it lunged sideways into a stack of ancient furniture and grew, feeding on the wood and cloth and old parchment with a hunger that had nothing natural about it, sprouting new heads even as Harry watched, a chimera's, a dragon's. shapes tearing themselves out of raw flame faster than the eye could follow. Crab, you absolute idiot. Draco's composure shattered entirely, all the careful menace gone, replaced by pure animal terror. You don't know how to control it, you don't know how to stop it. I don't need to stop it, Crab shouted, backing away from his own creation with a manic grin that was already curdling into something closer to horror as the fire spread faster than he'd apparently expected, climbing walls of junk, roaring louder, a beast tearing itself into being from pure destructive appetite. It'll get Potter, that's all that matters, that's all the Dark Lord ever wanted. The room was catching fast now, ancient dry wood and paper and cloth feeding a fire that had already grown too large and too many-headed for any of them to safely approach, thick black smoke boiling up toward a ceiling none of them could see. And Harry felt, for the first time since the ring had cracked open on a stone in a quiet forest, something that might genuinely have been the beginning of fear, not for himself, but for the three teenagers trapped in a burning room with a monster none of them knew how to fight. He didn't let it slow him down. Ron, Hermione, get to the door now. He was already moving, diadem clutched tight in one fist, wand coming up in the other, and the flame serpent had noticed them, was arcing through the burning wreckage toward the four of them with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for something so massive. Draco, Goyle, move, both of you now. You're helping us. Draco's voice cracked with disbelief even as he scrambled backward, dragging Goyle by the sleeve, both of them coughing against the thickening smoke. Argue about it later. Harry's mind raced through everything he knew about fiendfire, which wasn't much. Hermione had mentioned it once, in passing, during some late-night research session, called it one of the most dangerous fires in magic, nearly impossible to extinguish by ordinary means, capable of destroying even Horcruxes because it burned so completely nothing survived it. And even as that thought registered, he understood, with the flat clarity that had come to define every crisis since the ring, exactly what he needed to do. Watcher won't touch it, Hermione shouted over the roar, already backing toward the distant door with Ron's arm around her shoulders, both of them nearly to the threshold now. It needs to be unmade, Harry, not doused. There's a specific. She didn't get to finish, because Harry had already stopped listening to instructions and started listening to the strange, restless instinct that had been growing in him since the cup's destruction, the certainty that any magic witnessed clearly enough could be reproduced. He'd never seen anyone extinguish fiendfire, but he'd felt in that last vision, a flash of the boy who would become Voldemort watching a professor demonstrate an advanced vanishing charm exactly once before performing it flawlessly himself, and some deep, borrowed understanding in Harry's mind seemed to reach for the fire the way that boy had once reached for a spell he'd only glimpsed, understanding its shape from instinct rather than instruction. He raised his wand, planted his feet against the heat rolling off the flames in waves, and didn't shout anything dramatic. He simply said, quiet and certain, finite, incendio reverso. It wasn't a real spell. He'd never heard those words paired together before in his life. But something in the shape of his own intention, backed by the borrowed instinct for improvisation that lived in him now, made the words true the instant he spoke them. And the flame serpent, mid-lunge toward Draco and Goyle, seemed to fold in on itself, hunger turning suddenly inward, fire consuming fire until the massive, roaring shape collapsed into a shower of harmless, cooling ash that drifted down over the wreckage like gray snow. The room went abruptly, shockingly quiet, except for the crackle of smaller, ordinary fires still burning through scattered debris, and the ragged breathing of 5 teenagers who'd just come far closer to death than any of them had time to properly process. How, Draco said, staring at Harry with an expression that had entirely abandoned its earlier menace. Did you just do that? I don't fully know, Harry admitted, and it was true. He looked down at the diadem still gripped in his fist, and understood with the same clean certainty that had guided everything else since the ring, that he'd used something new just now, not fully formed yet, still raw but real, a piece of Voldemort's own improvisational brilliance, the thing that had made him the most dangerous duelist of his generation, working itself into Harry's hands before he'd even finished absorbing the Horcrux that would properly grant it. I haven't even destroyed this one yet, he thought, looking at the diadem, and it's already starting to bleed through. You just saved my life, Draco said slowly, like the words tasted strange in his mouth. You saved Goyle's life. After everything, I know. Why? Harry looked at him for a long moment, at the exhaustion and fear etched into a face that had spent 6 years sneering at him across classrooms and Quidditch pitches, and felt none of the old resentment rise up to answer the question. Just a tired, weary clarity, because you're not actually one of them, Draco, not really. You're just scared, and scared people do terrible things when they think it's the only way to protect the people they love. That's not the same as being evil. I've spent the last month meeting people who genuinely are, and you're not that. Not yet anyway. Maybe not ever if you get a chance to choose something else. Draco didn't have an answer for that. He stood there in the smoking wreckage of the room of requirement, staring at Harry with an expression somewhere between shame and something that might, given time, have grown into gratitude. And outside, muffled through stone walls that had somehow survived the fire, a deep, tolling bell began to ring. Not a school bell. Something older, more urgent, a sound Harry had never heard before but understood instantly, viscerally, as a warning. "That's the alarm," Hermione said, going pale. "Harry, that's the wards. Someone's breached the school wards." They came out of the room of requirement into a castle, already transforming around them. Suits of armor stomping to life along the corridors. Portraits shouting warnings and directions at students who ran past too fast to hear them. Professors moving with grim, hurried purpose toward the front gates. Somewhere below, through windows that looked out over the grounds, Harry could see torchlight massing beyond the boundary. Dozens and then hundreds of shapes gathering in the darkness, Death Eaters, giants looming among them, and something worse than either. A vast, seething tide of dark shapes that Harry recognized, with a cold lurch, as more Dementors than he'd ever seen assembled in one place in his life. "He's here," Harry said, and he didn't need the scar's old, familiar warmth to tell him that, though he felt it anyway, a low simmer against his forehead that used to precede screaming pain and now simply registered as information. "Voldemort's actually here." "Then we finish it," Draco said, and Harry turned to look at him in genuine surprise, because there was something new in Draco's voice, something that had been buried under fear for so long it sounded almost unfamiliar even to himself. "The diadem. Whatever it is you're doing with these things, finish it now, before whatever's coming actually starts." They found a quiet alcove off the main corridor, students and staff streaming past in both directions, McGonagall's voice somewhere distant and commanding, organizing defenses, and Harry set the diadem down on a windowsill and drove the sword through it without ceremony, the same way he'd finished the cup on that muddy lakeshore, because there wasn't time left for ritual or hesitation. The scream that erupted this time was different again, sharper, more frightened than any of the previous three, and Harry understood why the instant the vision hit him, because this piece of soul had known, somehow, that its destruction was coming close on the heels of three others, had felt its own fragmentary awareness of the pattern forming, and some deep animal part of it had genuinely feared what that pattern meant. Harry saw flashes this time, rather than long, sustained visions, quick, urgent fragments, as though whatever remained of this piece of soul was trying to communicate something rather than simply surrendering its memories. He saw a young man standing over a battlefield map, moving pieces with the calm, patient foresight of someone who'd already lived through the coming fight a dozen times in his head before it ever began, weighing every possible response his enemy might make 3 moves ahead. He saw that same clarity turn towards smaller moments too, a hand raised half a second before a curse arrived, because some part of the mind behind it had already calculated the angle, the timing, the inevitability of the strike before the strike itself had fully formed. Harry came back to himself standing upright this time, no collapse at all, just a brief, disorienting lurch like missing a step in the dark, and Draco was staring at him with something close to alarm. "Your eyes did the thing again," he said, went red for a second. "I know," Harry said, and found, testing the new sense settling into his mind, that he could already feel it working, a strange, layered awareness of the corridor around him, half a dozen small futures branching out from this exact moment, this exact configuration of running students and shouting professors and torchlight massing beyond the windows, all of them visible to him at once in a way that made the entire castle feel, suddenly, like a chessboard he could read 3 moves deep. "We need to get outside," he said, "now, before he brings the war to us instead of the other way round." The grounds of Hogwarts, when Harry finally stepped out through the front doors into the cold night air, looked like something out of a nightmare rendered in torchlight and shadow. A vast, dark army spread across the lawns beyond the boundary wards, giants stamping restlessly among ranks of black-robed Death Eaters, acromantulas skittering at the tree line, and above it all, drifting like a slow, patient tide, more Dementors than Harry had ever imagined existed in one place. Students and professors lined the castle steps and the courtyard behind him, wands raised, faces set with the particular grim determination of people who had decided, individually and collectively, that this was a fight they would not run from regardless of what it cost. Harry saw Neville near the front, jaw tight, sword, a different one, an old family blade, gripped in one steady hand. He saw Luna, calm as still water, wand loose and ready at her side. He saw professors he'd known for years standing shoulder to shoulder with seventh years who'd barely finished their OWL. And something in his chest tightened at the sight of all of it, all these people who had chosen to stay and fight rather than flee. And there, at the front of the massed army beyond the wards, standing apart from his followers the way he always stood apart from everyone, robed in black, pale face gleaming faintly in the torchlight, stood Voldemort. He didn't shout, he never needed to. His voice, when it came, carried across the grounds with unnatural clarity, amplified by magic that made it seem to originate from everywhere at once, from the air itself. "Harry Potter," the voice said, and Harry felt the old scar warmth flare brighter now that they were finally, physically, in the same place at last. "I know you're there. I can feel you, the way I've felt every piece of myself you've torn away from me over these last weeks. Come out. Let us finally speak as equals, since that's apparently what you've made yourself into." Harry didn't hesitate. He walked forward past the assembled defenders, past McGonagall's sharp, urgent whisper of his name, out to the very edge of the boundary wards, close enough that torchlight from the massed army beyond flickered orange across his face. "I'm here," he called back. "You don't need to shout across a whole battlefield. I can hear you fine." A ripple of something, surprise maybe, or simple disbelief, moved through the ranks of Death Eaters at the casual, almost bored tone of it, a boy addressing the most feared wizard alive as though he were mildly inconveniencing him rather than terrifying him. "You've been busy," Voldemort said, and there was something almost conversational in it now, cold curiosity layered over old fury. "4 of my anchors, gone, in the span of a month, after years of doing nothing productive at all. Tell me, Potter, do you understand yet what you've been doing to yourself, chasing after pieces of me the way a child chases fireflies, catching light he doesn't understand and swallowing it whole?" "I understand it fine," Harry said. "Better than you do, probably. You built those things to make yourself immortal. Instead, you built a set of keys and handed every single one of them to the one person who was always going to come looking for a way to kill you." Something flickered across Voldemort's pale face at that, not quite alarm, but close to it, the particular stillness of a man who had just heard his own worst fear stated plainly by the person causing it. "You think you understand what's happening to you," Voldemort said, "but you don't, not yet. You've taken fragments of instinct, fragments of skill, and you mistake them for strength, the way a child mistakes a borrowed sword for swordsmanship. What happens, Potter, when you've taken all 7, when there's nothing left of me but you? Have you considered that? Have you considered what it will mean when the last piece finally comes loose, and there's no longer a difference left between the boy who lived and the monster he swore to destroy?" The question landed harder than Harry expected, a small, cold seed of doubt he hadn't let himself examine too closely in the rush of everything else. And for one unguarded second, he felt it settle in his chest, not fear exactly. That particular emotion still didn't seem to live in him properly anymore, but something adjacent to it, a genuine uncertainty about what he was becoming. He didn't let it show. He'd learned enough in the last month about controlling what crossed his own face. "I've considered it," Harry said, "and I've decided it doesn't matter, because the difference between us was never about power. It was never about what either of us could do. It's about what we choose to do with it. You've had every kind of power imaginable for 50 years, and you've spent every scrap of it making people afraid of you. I'm not interested in that. I never was. So keep asking your question if it makes you feel better, but I already know the answer, and you're not going to like it." Voldemort's red eyes narrowed, and something in his expression shifted, calculation replacing curiosity, and Harry, with the new, strange, layered awareness the diadem had left blooming in his mind, saw the shift coming a half-second before it happened, saw the intention forming behind those red eyes like a chess move he'd already anticipated 3 turns ahead. "Then let us test your theory," Voldemort said, and raised his wand, and the massed army behind him surged forward in a single, coordinated wave, and the Battle of Hogwarts began. The first curse came from Voldemort himself, a bolt of green light, fast and merciless, aimed not at the boundary line but directly at Harry, close enough now that there was no room for hesitation of any kind. Harry's body moved before conscious thought caught up with it, sidestepping with an economy that felt, even to him, faster and cleaner than anything he'd managed before, the diadem's borrowed foresight already showing him the curse's path a half-second before it fully formed. Behind him, the courtyard exploded into motion, professors and students surging past him to meet the army pouring across the grounds, spellfire lighting up the darkness in blazing arcs of red and gold and sickly green, giants crashing through the outer walls with earth-shaking force, and Harry, standing at the very center of it all, felt something settle over him that was less like fear and more like clarity, the entire chaotic battlefield resolving itself, in his borrowed awareness, into a series of solvable, sequential problems. He fought like something out of a story after that, though he never once thought of it that way himself, too busy moving from one crisis to the next to spare attention for how it might have looked to anyone watching. He caught a curse meant for a fleeing first year and redirected it into the ground before the child had even finished screaming. He saw, a full 2 seconds before it happened, that a section of the courtyard wall was about to collapse under sustained bombardment, and had already levitated 3 students clear of the rubble before the stones finished falling. He fought 2 Death Eaters simultaneously without breaking stride, disarming one and stunning the other in the same fluid motion, because some part of his mind was already 3 moves ahead of both of them, watching the shape of their intentions form before their wands had finished rising. Harry. Ron's shout cut through the general roar of battle, and Harry turned to find him locked in a desperate duel with a masked Death Eater twice his size, Hermione a few feet away handling 2 more with the kind of ferocious, precise spellwork that 6 years of studying harder than anyone else in her year had finally, properly earned her. Harry crossed the distance in 3 strides, disarmed Ron's opponent with a flick of his wrist, and turned in time to catch Hermione's attackers in a double stunner that dropped them both before they'd finished registering he'd arrived. "You're terrifying," Ron said, breathless, grinning despite the chaos around them, blood trickling from a cut above one eyebrow. "You know that? You're actually terrifying now." "Focus on staying alive," Harry said. "Both of you, I mean it. Where are you going?" Harry didn't answer immediately, because he'd felt something shift in the pattern of the battle a moment before, a specific targeted movement in the chaos, a familiar dark shape moving with deliberate purpose through the fighting toward the castle's side entrance, away from the main engagement, and beside her, coiled and enormous, a thick, pale serpent that Harry recognized instantly from every nightmare he'd ever had about it. "Nagini," he breathed. "Voldemort's keeping her close. That has to be the last one, the last Horcrux still with him." He didn't get the chance to say anything else, because that was the moment Bellatrix Lestrange, laughing high and wild amid the chaos of the battle, spotted him across the courtyard and came at him with a scream of pure, delighted fury, curses streaming from her wand faster than most duelists could manage in a lifetime of practice. Harry turned to meet her, and for the first time since the ring had cracked open in that quiet forest, he found himself facing an opponent whose skill genuinely tested every borrowed piece of power he'd accumulated. Bellatrix moved like violence given shape, unpredictable and joyful and utterly without restraint, and even with the diadem's foresight whispering half a second ahead of every strike, Harry had to work, properly work, to keep pace with her. "Little baby Potter," she crooned between curses, her wand tracing patterns that made the air itself hiss and crackle. "Playing dress up in my master's power. Do you think it makes you him? Do you think borrowed clothes make a king?" "Don't need to be him," Harry said, deflecting a cutting curse close enough to feel the wind of it against his cheek. "Just need to beat him. And you're in the way of that right now, which is a shame for you." She laughed, delighted rather than offended, and pressed harder, and the duel between them dragged on for nearly a full minute, an eternity in dueling terms, until Harry, reading the shape of her next 3 moves in the strange, layered clarity the diadem had given him, feinted left, let her commit fully to a curse aimed at where he should have been, and stepped instead directly into the gap her overextension left open, disarming her with a single sharp flick of his wand before she'd even finished registering that he'd moved at all. Bellatrix stared at her empty hand, at her own wand spinning through the air into Harry's waiting grip, with an expression of genuine, wounded shock that lasted exactly as long as it took Neville Longbottom, arriving at a dead run with his own blade already swinging, to tackle her bodily to the ground before she could recover. "Go," Neville shouted, wrestling to bind her with grim, determined effort. "I've got her. Go find whatever it is you're actually looking for, Harry. I can see it on your face." Harry didn't argue. He turned toward the side entrance where he'd last glimpsed that pale, coiling shape moving away from the main battle, Voldemort's most precious, most guarded secret slithering off into the chaos of a war that had, in the space of 20 minutes, become the largest and most desperate battle magical Britain had seen in a generation. Behind him, across the ruined courtyard, amid the screaming and the spellfare and the smoke, Voldemort stood at the heart of his own advancing army, red eyes fixed on the exact spot where Harry had vanished into the castle, and understood with cold, dawning certainty exactly what the boy was hunting now. He knows, Voldemort thought, and for the first time in his very long life, standing amid an army built to conquer, Lord Voldemort felt something close to genuine, unfamiliar panic settle into his chest, because there was only one Horcrux left after Nagini, and it lived somewhere he could never, ever destroy without destroying himself along with it. He raised his wand and began pushing forward through his own ranks, toward the castle, toward the boy, because whatever else happened tonight, he would not, allow Harry Potter to reach the snake before he did. Chapter 5, Nagini's Coil. The corridor beyond the side entrance was dark in a way the rest of the castle wasn't. No torchlight had reached this far. No defenders had thought to hold this particular stretch of stone, and Harry moved through it fast and quiet, wand raised. The diadem's borrowed foresight painting faint, half-formed impressions of the space ahead of him even before he turned each corner. He caught up with the trail near the old greenhouses, glass shattered from stray spellfire, herbs and vines spilling out through broken frames into the mud, and there, coiled loosely around a stone planter as though she had all the time in the world, was Nagini. She was larger than Harry remembered from his visions of her, 12 feet at least, scales gleaming pale and sickly in the moonlight, and when her head lifted to regard him, tongue flickering, he felt the old scar warmth pulse harder against his forehead, closer to real pain than it had been in weeks. "There you are," said a voice from the shadows beyond the greenhouse, and Harry turned to find Fenrir Greyback stepping out from behind a collapsed section of wall, grinning with all those filed, yellow teeth, flanked by two hulking figures Harry recognized as recent recruits from Azkaban's emptied cells. "Been looking forward to a second go at you, boy. No friends to hide behind this time." "I wasn't hiding behind them the first time either," Harry said. "You should have noticed that." "Oh, I noticed plenty." Greyback's grin widened, and behind him, one of the two escaped convicts flexed thick, scarred hands, eager for violence in the particular way men get eager when they've spent years in a cell dreaming about exactly this. "Noticed you're just a boy with a lucky trick or two. My master wants that snake protected personally, and he was very specific that if you came looking for her, we weren't to let you get anywhere near." "That's a shame for you," Harry said, "because I'm not planning to ask permission." Greyback moved first, faster than a man his size should have been able to move, claws already extending, and Harry met him the same way he'd met him in the forest weeks ago, without flinching, without stepping back, wand already tracing the shape of the fight 3 moves ahead of where Greyback's body currently was. He caught the werewolf's lunge with a banishing charm that sent him crashing back through a greenhouse wall in an explosion of shattered glass, and turned in the same motion to catch the first convict's curse on a shield that barely flickered with effort, and disarmed the second before either understood the fight had already turned against them. Greyback dragged himself up out of the wreckage, bleeding from a dozen small glass cuts, snarling. "You're not human," he spat. "Whatever's happening to you, that's not natural, that's not." "You're right," Harry said. "It's not, doesn't mean it's not mine." He didn't wait for a response. He caught Greyback with a full-body bind that dropped the werewolf mid-lunge, hard onto the churned mud, and turned toward the two convicts, who, watching their leader go down without landing a single blow, had already begun backing away with the particular speed of men reevaluating their life choices in real time. "Go," Harry told them. "Tell whoever sent you that the snake's not staying protected much longer." They ran. Greyback, bound and furious on the ground, snarled something Harry didn't bother listening to, and beyond the ruined greenhouse walls, Nagini had begun to slide away through the mud toward the darker reaches of the grounds, sensing danger in the shape of a boy who just dismantled her guards in under a minute. Harry followed. She led him a long way, past the edge of the forbidden forest, along a winding, overgrown path that skirted the lake, moonlight silvering the water on his left while the trees loomed dark and watchful on his right, and Harry understood, following that pale, gliding shape through the dark, that she wasn't simply fleeing. She was leading him somewhere specific, and the specificity of it made the hair on the back of his neck rise in a way none of his other new confidence could quite override. He found out where when the path opened into a small, overgrown clearing, and there, waiting with the patient, absolute stillness of a predator who'd simply decided to stop being chased, stood Lord Voldemort. "I wondered how long it would take you to work it out," Voldemort said. Nagini slid across the clearing to coil at his feet, and he rested one long, pale hand against her scales almost tenderly, the way a man might comfort a favorite hound. "You've been remarkably efficient, Potter, I'll grant you that. 4 Horcruxes in a month. It took me the better part of 2 decades to hide them all, and you've unmade most of them faster than I managed to place them." "I had good reasons to move fast." Harry kept his wand raised, kept his distance, aware of the massive battle still raging somewhere behind him, muffled by trees and distance into a low, constant roar of spellfire and screaming, and aware too that he had walked, quite deliberately, into a clearing with the single most dangerous wizard in Britain and no one else around to help him if this went wrong. He found, testing himself the way he'd tested himself against Greyback in the woods weeks ago, that the old fear still refused to surface. What replaced it instead was something colder and clearer, the understanding that this was, in all likelihood, exactly the confrontation everything since the ring had been building toward, and that running from it now would help no one. "You came alone," Voldemort observed. "No Weasley, no Granger, none of that little army you've apparently assembled out of half the school. Why is that, do you suppose? Confidence or carelessness?" "Neither. I didn't want them here for this part." "Sentiment." Voldemort's mouth curved into something that was almost, horribly, a smile. "How very like you. Dumbledore's greatest weakness, worn now on the boy he handed his war to. Tell me, Potter, has it occurred to you yet, in all your triumphant collecting, that every piece of me you've absorbed makes you less like the person you're trying to protect them by keeping them away? You wear my instincts. You use my improvisation, my foresight, my mastery, my resistance to the fears that make ordinary men easy to control. How much longer before you start making my choices too?" "I've made my choices every single time," Harry said. "That's the part you keep skipping past, because it's inconvenient for whatever argument you're building. I could have used the locket to torture information out of half the ministry. I could have kept the cup and let it multiply gold forever, made myself richer than the goblins. I could have let Draco burn in that room tonight and called it justice. I didn't do any of those things, and I'm not going to, no matter how many pieces of you end up living in me before this is over." Something flickered across Voldemort's pale face, not quite anger, something colder and more calculating. "Then let us test that particular claim properly," he said, "because I think you overestimate how much choice remains in it. Nagini." The snake moved with shocking speed, uncoiling from around his feet and launching herself across the clearing toward Harry in a single fluid strike, fangs bared, and Harry's borrowed foresight screamed a half-second warning that let him twist aside just enough to avoid the full force of the lunge, her fangs raking across his forearm instead of sinking into his throat, venom burning white-hot through the shallow wound. He didn't cry out. He gritted his teeth against the fire, spreading up his arm, and brought his wand around in a tight arc, catching her mid-recoil with a severing charm that she dodged with a speed no ordinary serpent should have possessed, and understood, watching her circle back for a second strike, that Voldemort's soul magic had made her faster and more dangerous than nature ever intended. "The venom will slow you," Voldemort said, watching with clinical interest from across the clearing, making no move to intervene directly, letting his familiar do the work while he studied the results like a scientist observing an experiment. "Basilisk venom killed instantly because a basilisk's venom carries a very particular, ancient toxicity. Nagini's is different, slower. It will not kill you tonight, Potter, but it will weaken you steadily, and I am curious to see what remains of your composure once pain finally starts to matter to you again." Harry felt it, the venom's burn deepening, spreading past his elbow now, a dull ache settling into his bones that hadn't been there 30 seconds ago, and understood, with the same flat clarity that had carried him through every crisis since the ring, that Voldemort was right about one thing at least. This was going to hurt, properly hurt, in a way that fear alone couldn't override, because pain wasn't fear. Pain was simply pain, and no amount of borrowed courage made a wound stop bleeding. He didn't let that slow him down either. He caught Nagini's second lunge with a conjured chain that wrapped tight around her body mid-strike, and though she thrashed and tore at the metal with fangs and coiling strength, he held the spell steady, feeding more force into it with every passing second even as his injured arm screamed protest, until the chains bit deep enough into her scales that she finally, furiously, stilled. "Impressive," Voldemort said, and there was, for the first time, something in his voice that sounded almost like genuine, reluctant respect. "Truly, very few wizards alive could bind her so completely, venom weakened or not." He raised his own wand, unhurried, almost lazy. "Fortunately, I have never needed to rely on her alone." The curse that followed came fast and silent, no warning shape for Harry's foresight to catch because Voldemort's own skill outpaced the borrowed instinct entirely. A spell Harry didn't recognize, dark and twisting, and it caught him full in the chest before he could raise a shield, driving him backward off his feet and into the mud with an impact that knocked the breath entirely out of his lungs. He lay there for a long moment, ears ringing, venom fire climbing steadily up past his shoulder now, and through the haze of pain he heard Voldemort's footsteps approaching, slow and unhurried, the walk of a predator who had already decided the outcome and was simply enjoying the last few moments before confirming it. "You see," Voldemort said, standing over him now, red eyes gleaming in the moonlight, "this is the flaw in everything you've built, Potter. You've accumulated fragments: instinct, mastery, foresight, resistance to fear. Impressive fragments, I grant you, but fragments are not the whole. I am the whole. 50 years of study, of practice, of power earned rather than inherited secondhand from pieces of myself I chose to discard. You cannot simply collect your way into being my equal." Harry, lying in the mud with venom burning through his veins and his chest aching from the impact, felt something rise up in him that had nothing to do with borrowed power at all, something older, simpler, entirely his own. He thought of Cedric, dead in a graveyard because of this man. He thought of his parents, dead in a nursery because of this man. He thought of Sirius falling through a veil, of Dumbledore falling from a tower, of every single person who'd bled and died across 17 years so that this exact moment, this exact confrontation could finally happen. He started to laugh. It came out rough, half-strangled by pain, but it was real, and Voldemort's expression shifted just slightly at the sound of it, wrong-footed by a reaction he clearly hadn't anticipated. "You think this is funny," he said. "A little." Harry pushed himself up onto one elbow, ignoring the venom's burn, ignoring the ache in his ribs. "You just spent an entire speech explaining how I can't be your equal because I only have fragments of you. But you're the one who put those fragments where I could find them. You made yourself vulnerable in 7 different places because you were so certain nobody would ever be brave enough, or stupid enough, or loved enough to go looking. And now you're standing over me complaining that the plan didn't work the way you wanted, when the only reason it's not working is that you built it wrong from the start. I built the most successful immortality construct in the history of magic," Voldemort said, and his voice had gone very quiet now. The register Harry had learned, through countless retold stories, meant true and dangerous fury. "You built a countdown clock," Harry said, and handed the timer to the one person you should never have made a target. He got his feet under him, unsteady but upright, wand still gripped in his good hand despite the venom spreading fire. "You want to know what I've actually learned from carrying pieces of you around, Tom? I've learned that everything that ever made you dangerous, the mastery, the instinct, the total absence of fear, none of it actually needed to be evil. It could have been anything. It could have been you if you'd made one different choice at 11 years old, standing in an orphanage, deciding the world owed you nothing, and you'd take everything from it instead. I got the same raw materials you did. I just built something else out of them." For a moment, standing in that moonlit clearing with a wounded, venom-poisoned boy refusing to fall, Lord Voldemort said nothing at all, and something in his pale, ancient face flickered with an expression that had no place there, that he would have denied feeling if anyone had dared name it aloud. The particular, cold vertigo of a man realizing, for the first time in 50 years, that he might genuinely lose. Then he raised his wand again, and whatever flicker of doubt had crossed his face vanished back into cold, methodical calculation. "Sentiment," he said again, quieter this time, "has never once won a war, Potter, no matter how prettily you dress it up in speeches. Crucio." Harry had no time to dodge, no borrowed foresight fast enough to outrun a curse thrown from 3 feet away by the most skilled duelist alive, and the pain that tore through him was immediate and total, worse than the venom, worse than anything he'd felt since the graveyard 4 years ago, and he went down hard onto his knees, teeth clenched against a scream he refused, absolutely refused, to give Voldemort the satisfaction of hearing. "Scream," Voldemort said softly, holding the curse steady, watching with something almost curious in his expression, as though genuinely interested in how long defiance could survive against pure physical agony. "There is no shame in it. Everyone screams eventually." Harry didn't scream. He clung to the wand still gripped in his shaking hand, clung to the memory of everyone who died to give him this exact chance to stand in this exact clearing. And through the white-hot roar of pain, some deep, borrowed instinct, not from any single Horcrux this time, but from all 4 combined, working together in ways Harry hadn't consciously understood until this exact desperate moment, showed him something he hadn't seen before. The curse's shape, its structure, the specific twist of will and intention required to sustain it, laid out before his inner eye with the same clarity the cup's power had once shown him a spell cast by his own friends. "I've watched this spell. I've seen it enough times. I know its shape." He raised his wand through sheer, grinding force of will, and instead of trying to shield against the Cruciatus, he did something he'd never attempted before, something that shouldn't have been possible for a wizard his age against a curse of that magnitude. He reached into the spell's own structure and unraveled it from the inside, the same improvised, instinctive unmaking he'd used against Crab's fiendfire in the room of requirement. The pain stopped so suddenly it left him gasping, curled forward in the mud, and Voldemort took an actual step backward, red eyes wide with something that was, unmistakably, shock. "That is not possible," he said, and his voice had lost its cold composure entirely now. "No one unmakes the Cruciatus from within. Not Dumbledore, not anyone." "I did," Harry said, dragging himself upright again, blood and mud streaking his robes, venom still burning steadily up his arm but no longer alone in commanding his attention. "Turns out 4 pieces of you add up to more than you thought they would." He didn't wait for Voldemort's response. He turned instead toward Nagini, still bound in chains a few feet away, thrashing weakly, and understood with total clarity that this was the moment, that whatever came next between himself and Voldemort mattered less, right now, than finishing what he'd come to this clearing to do. Voldemort understood it in the same instant. No. Harry had already crossed the distance, sword drawn from where Hermione had insisted he strap it across his own back before he'd gone off alone into the dark, and he drove the blade down through Nagini's bound, writhing body with a single, decisive strike that ended, in one motion, both the snake's life and the 5th piece of Voldemort's soul it had carried for over a decade. The scream that erupted this time didn't sound like the others at all. It sounded horribly, almost human, a sound torn from something that understood, in its very last moment of existence, exactly what its ending meant for the man who'd made it. And Voldemort screamed too. It happened simultaneously, the Horcrux's death and the Dark Lord's own agonized cry, doubled over in the clearing's moonlight, both hands pressed to his chest as though something inside him had physically torn loose, and Harry, caught in the aftermath of destroying a Horcrux for the 5th time, felt the vision hit him even as he watched his enemy collapse to his knees 10 feet away. This vision came differently than any before it. It wasn't memory. It wasn't skill or instinct, passed down from some earlier version of the boy who would become Voldemort. It was something older, stranger, tied not to Tom Riddle's personal history, but to the deep, ancient magic Nagini herself had touched across her long, twisted existence as a living vessel for a fragment of soul, a raw, visceral understanding of the boundary between life and death itself, the fragile membrane separating the two, and how a will strong enough, focused enough, could reach across that boundary and touch what lay on either side of it. Harry came back to himself, standing over Nagini's still body, and felt something settle into the deepest part of him, quiet and vast and faintly terrifying in its scope. An awareness, sudden and complete, of every dying thing within a significant radius of where he stood, of the exact, fragile thread connecting life to the body that housed it, and of his own, sudden, undeniable capacity to reach for that thread and either mend it or cut it, should he choose to. He looked down at his venom-burned arm, and without quite understanding how he knew to do it, pressed his fingers against the wound, and felt the poison spread simply, stop. Not heal entirely, not vanish, but arrest, held in place by an act of will that had, 10 minutes ago, been entirely beyond his capability. Across the clearing, Voldemort had dragged himself upright again, and his face, when he turned it toward Harry, had lost every trace of its earlier cold composure. What remained instead was something raw and furious, and for the very first time in this entire war, genuinely afraid. 5, he said, and his voice shook just slightly, in a way Harry had never heard from him before. 5 of them gone, and I can feel what's happening to you, Potter. I can feel it in the way the world itself is starting to react to you differently. You have no idea what you're becoming. I have some idea, Harry said quietly. More than I did an hour ago, at least. There is one anchor left, Voldemort said, and something in his voice had shifted from fury into something closer to raw, desperate calculation, a man rapidly recalculating a war he had believed, until tonight, was entirely his to win. 1, and I will not allow you anywhere near it, do you understand me? Whatever you have become, whatever pieces of me now live inside you, I built this, I built all of this, decades of careful, patient work, and I will not let a boy with borrowed power dismantle it in the space of a single month. You keep saying things like that, Harry said, like repeating it enough times is going to make it true. It hasn't worked yet, Tom. I don't think it's about to start now. Voldemort's face contorted, fury finally breaking through the fear, and he raised his wand for another curse and stopped abruptly as a fresh wave of sound rolled through the trees toward them, distant shouting, spellfire, the unmistakable clamor of a battle shifting direction, moving closer. Somewhere beyond the tree line, torchlight flickered through the branches, and a voice, Ron's voice, hoarse and desperate, carrying across the dark grounds, shouted Harry's name with an urgency that cut through everything else happening in that clearing. Voldemort's red eyes flicked toward the sound, calculating, and something in his expression shifted from fury back into cold, methodical strategy, a predator recognizing, even in a moment of genuine fear, that the terrain had just changed against him. "Not tonight, then," he said quietly, "but do not mistake this retreat for surrender, Potter. I have survived worse than you. I have survived losing pieces of myself before and rebuilt from less. Whatever you think you've won here tonight, you have only bought yourself time, not victory." "I know the difference," Harry said. "I'm not stupid enough to think this is over." Voldemort studied him for one more long moment, venom-burned, blood-streaked, exhausted, and utterly unafraid. And then, with a sharp crack that displaced the air of the clearing, he was simply gone, apparating away into the dark, leaving Harry alone beside Nagini's still body and the ruined chains that had briefly held her. Ron burst through the tree line moments later, wand raised, face streaked with blood and dirt, and stopped short at the sight of Harry standing alone in the moonlit clearing. "Mate, are you?" He took in the venom marks on Harry's arm, the mud, the blood, and his face went white. "What happened? He's gone," Harry said. "For now, Nagini's dead. That's 5. Ron let out a breath that shook audibly, relief and horror tangled together. Hermione's holding the east courtyard with Flitwick. "The giants are, Harry. It's bad up there. It's really bad. We need you." "I'm coming." Harry started walking, faster than his exhausted body wanted to move, venom still simmering dully in his veins despite whatever he'd managed to do to slow it. "Tell me everything on the way. How many down? Who needs help first?" Ron talked as they moved, voice tight and fast, cataloging casualties and desperate holdouts, and the general grinding chaos of a battle that had been raging for the better part of an hour now. And Harry listened with half his attention while the other half turned inward, testing the strange new awareness settling into the deepest part of his mind, that sense of life and death and the fragile, breakable thread between them, vast and quiet and entirely his own now. 6 left, he thought, as the castle's burning outline came into view through the trees, spellfire still lighting the night sky in flashes of red and green. "Just one more, and I don't even know where it is." He didn't let the uncertainty slow his pace. Whatever waited for him back at that battle, whatever waited for him after it, he understood now, with the same flat, unshakable clarity that had carried him through every crisis since a cracked ring had first split open in a quiet forest, that he would face it standing, and he would face it without flinching, no matter how much of Voldemort's own borrowed darkness he had to carry to get there. Voldemort reappeared inside the ruined entrance hall of Hogwarts, breathing hard in a way he had not breathed hard in decades, and found Bellatrix waiting for him near the base of the grand staircase, freed from Neville's binds by 2 Death Eaters moments before, her wild dark eyes searching his face with desperate concern. "My lord, you're hurt. I am not hurt." His voice came out sharper than he intended, and he steadied it with visible effort. "The snake is dead. Nagini is gone." Bellatrix's face crumpled, genuine grief flickering through the fanatic devotion that usually dominated her every expression. "My lord, I'm so sorry. I should have. You should have done nothing differently, because there was nothing you could have done." Voldemort's gaze swept the ruined hall, students and defenders, and his own followers still locked in scattered pockets of desperate combat throughout the castle, the sound of it echoing up through broken stairwells and shattered windows. "6 of my anchors are gone, Bellatrix. Only the last remains, and it is safe. It has always been safe, in a place no one would ever think to look, because I made certain of it personally, decades ago, when I still believed patience alone would be enough to protect what I'd built." "Then we've still won," Bellatrix said, fierce and desperate. "Even now, even with everything he's taken from you, he still can't touch the last one. He doesn't even know where to look." Voldemort said nothing for a long moment, standing amid the wreckage of a battle he had entered fully expecting to win within the hour, and thought of the boy in that clearing, venom-poisoned, curse-struck, exhausted past any reasonable measure of human endurance, refusing at every single turn to fall. He does not need to know where to look, he thought, with a cold, creeping certainty that felt, for the first time in his very long existence, genuinely and irreversibly like fear. He simply needs to keep destroying pieces of me until there is nothing left of the man I was, and become, instead, everything I ever was and everything I chose not to be. And I do not know, any longer, whether I have the power left to stop him from finishing what he started. He did not say any of that aloud. He simply turned, robes sweeping the shattered marble floor, and strode back toward the sounds of battle, because whatever else the night held, he had built an empire on the principle of never once allowing fear to dictate his actions. And he was not, even now, prepared to abandon that principle, not while there remained one single, precious anchor still hidden, still safe, still his. Chapter 6. The boy who became more. The battle had not paused for Harry's absence. If anything, it had grown uglier in the time he'd spent in that dark clearing with Voldemort, and when he came back through the trees at Ron's shoulder, the sight that greeted him made something cold and furious settle low in his chest. A giant had breached the courtyard wall entirely, its massive fists smashing through stone that had stood for 1,000 years, and beneath its swinging arms a knot of defenders, third years. Harry realized with a jolt. Kids who should have been evacuated hours ago were scrambling for cover that didn't exist. Professor Sprout was down on one knee, blood streaming from her scalp, still casting despite it. Somewhere above them, on the ramparts, Fred and George Weasley were laying down covering fire with the manic, grim precision of men who'd stopped being funny for the first time either of them could remember. Harry didn't think. He raised his wand and the giant's next swing simply stopped in midair. Arrested by a force spell Harry hadn't consciously chosen to cast. The borrowed instinct from 4 absorbed Horcruxes moving faster than his own decision-making could keep pace with. And then he was running, closing the distance, and the giant turned its huge, dim-eyed head toward him with the slow confusion of something that had never once, in its long life, encountered resistance it couldn't simply crush. "Get the kids clear," Harry shouted at Sprout, and didn't wait to see if she obeyed, because he was already past her, already close enough that the giant's next swing came down at him directly. And he caught the blow, genuinely caught it, wandless, both hands raised, feeling the impact drive him back a full 3 feet through churned mud, and held it there, muscles screaming, until Ron and 2 seventh years he didn't recognize got the last of the third years clear of the wreckage. Then he let go of the giant's fist, stepped back, and hit it with a spell he'd never used before and somehow already knew, something that made the enormous creature's legs simply fold beneath it, dropping it, harmless and unconscious, into the ruined courtyard with an impact that shook dust from every remaining window in the castle. "That's Harry, that's not a spell. I've never even heard of a spell that does that," Ron said, staring. "I know some new things now." Harry was already moving again, scanning the chaos for the next crisis, and there was always a next crisis. A knot of Death Eaters pressing Flitwick back toward the greenhouses, a Dementor swarm drifting low over the lake toward a cluster of fleeing first years, a section of the castle's east wing genuinely on fire now, flames licking up through shattered windows into the smoke-heavy sky. He moved through all of it the way water moves through a landscape it's already decided to reshape. Not frantic, not desperate, simply present wherever the need was greatest, arriving half a second before disaster and leaving half a second after it had been averted, and slowly, gradually, the tide of the battle began to bend. It was Hermione who found him near the collapsed section of the entrance hall, her face streaked with soot, wand hand shaking with exhaustion but her eyes sharp and urgent. "Harry, it's Professor Snape." Something in her tone made his stomach drop even before she finished. "What about him?" "McGonagall says he fled the castle the moment the battle turned against the Death Eaters holding the upper floors. Nobody's seen him since, but there's fighting near the boathouse, and somebody said they saw him there, Voldemort himself and Harry, I think." She didn't need to finish. Harry was already running. He found them in the low, gray shed at the lake's edge, moonlight slanting through gaps in the old wooden slats, and the scene inside stopped him dead in the doorway for one terrible, frozen second. Severus Snape lay against the far wall, blood soaking dark through his robes at the throat, and Voldemort stood over him, wand still raised, red eyes calm and cold in a way that made Harry's borrowed instinct scream warning even before his conscious mind caught up. "The wand does not answer to me," Voldemort was saying, more to himself than to the dying man in front of him, his voice carrying that flat, distracted quality of a problem being worked through aloud. "It should. Dumbledore's wand should have transferred its loyalty to whoever disarmed him, and by all accounts that was you, Severus. So I must take what the wand requires from the one who holds its true allegiance, if I am ever to wield it properly." "You didn't need to do this," Snape said, his voice a wet, terrible rasp, and something in the words carried none of the fear Harry might have expected, only a kind of weary, exhausted relief, as though this particular ending had been anticipated for so long that its actual arrival came almost as a release. "You could have simply asked me. I would have told you the truth. The wand was never mine to lose." "It doesn't matter now," Voldemort said, and Harry understood in the half-second before it happened exactly what was about to occur, and knew, with cold, absolute certainty, that he was not fast enough to stop it. Avada Kedavra. The green light took Snape mid-breath, and he slumped sideways against the wall without another sound, and Harry, arriving through the doorway a full half-second too late, wand already raised, fury boiling up through him hot and immediate, caught Voldemort's turning, startled gaze and understood that this time, at least, there would be no clever escape, no retreat into shadow. You've done that twice now, Harry said, voice shaking with a rage that had nothing borrowed about it at all. Killed someone right in front of me and thought you'd get to just walk away after. Potter. Voldemort's composure had already reasserted itself, cold and precise. I did not expect you quite so soon. No matter. Severus served his purpose either way. His purpose. Harry's hand tightened on his wand. He spent 17 years lying to everyone he knew, including me, because Dumbledore asked him to, and you just killed him over a wand. The Elder Wand requires absolute loyalty from its master, Voldemort said. I could not risk it answering to a dead man's former servant instead of to me. You would understand the necessity if you understood the wand's history properly. I don't care about the wand's history. Harry was already moving, wand rising, and Voldemort met the first curse with a shield that flared briefly gold before both of them, in unspoken mutual agreement, broke off the exchange, because there were still Death Eaters closing on the boathouse from outside, drawn by the flash of spellfare, and neither of them wanted this particular confrontation ended prematurely by outside interference. Voldemort retreated through a side door into the dark, and Harry let him go, because Snape's body still lay slumped against the far wall, and something in Harry, some deep, unresolved thread that had nothing to do with power at all, refused to leave that room without at least trying. He knelt beside him, and though the man's chest had already gone still, Harry reached out with the new, careful legilimency the locket had given him weeks ago, pressing gently at the very edge of a mind that was, even now, still fading rather than fully gone, the way a candle takes a moment to finish going dark after the flame itself has died. What came through wasn't words. It was images, fast and fragmentary, offered up freely now in a way Snape had never once permitted in life. A red-haired girl laughing beside a river, years and years of quiet, aching devotion offered to a woman who never returned it the same way, a promise made to a headmaster in a moment of raw, broken grief, and threaded through every single memory, unmistakable and undeniable, love. Not the performance of loyalty Harry had spent 7 years believing was all Snape had ever felt toward anyone. Actual, complicated, self-punishing love, carried in silence for longer than Harry had been alive. And beneath it all, the final memory, offered up like a confession finally allowed to surface. Dumbledore in his office, explaining quietly that Harry himself carried a fragment of Voldemort's soul, planted the night the curse had rebounded in that nursery, living quietly in the scar for 16 years, and that this piece, this final, 7th Horcrux, could only be destroyed the way all the others had been destroyed, and that Harry would need to walk toward Voldemort and let him try to end it. Harry pulled back from the memory, breathing hard, and sat very still beside a dead man's body for a long moment, letting the truth of it settle into him. I'm the last one. He looked down at his own hands, steady despite everything, and understood, with a clarity that had nothing to do with borrowed instinct and everything to do with simple human choice, exactly what came next. He found Ron and Hermione in the Great Hall, where the wounded were being gathered under Madame Pomfrey's harried direction, and the dead, too many already, more than Harry let himself look at directly, lay covered along one wall in careful, terrible rows. Ginny was there, blood-streaked but upright, arguing fiercely with her mother about staying on the front lines. Neville sat slumped against a table, exhausted, sword still gripped loosely in one hand as though he'd forgotten how to let it go. Harry, Hermione's face when she saw him went through relief and then immediately alarm, reading something in his expression she didn't like at all. What happened? Where's Snape? Dead. Harry's voice came out steadier than he expected. Voldemort killed him, over the Elder Wand of all things. Oh, Hermione's hand went to her mouth. Ron said nothing, just closed his eyes briefly, and Harry understood that neither of them had ever really hated Snape the way they'd once wanted to, not properly, not after everything the war had shown them about the man. There's something else. Harry looked between them both and made the decision, quickly and completely, that he was not going to do what a version of himself 6 months ago might have done, sneak off alone into the dark, leave a note, spare them the choice of stopping him. I'm the last Horcrux. The silence that followed lasted 3 full seconds, and then Hermione said, very quietly, "What? The night he tried to kill me as a baby. When the curse rebounded, it left a piece of him behind, in me." In the scar, Harry kept his voice level, watching the horror dawn across both their faces in real time. Dumbledore knew. He told Snape, and Snape just gave me the memory of it. I have to go find him. I have to let him try to kill me, and if it works the way it's worked every other time, the piece inside me dies and I don't. If it works that way, Hermione said, voice rising. Harry, that's not a plan, that's a guess dressed up as certainty. You can't possibly. I can and I'm going to. He said it gently, but there was no give in it at all, none of the old uncertainty that might once have let her talk him out of something this dangerous. I've spent this entire month getting stronger every single time I destroy one of these things. I don't think this is any different. I think it's just harder because this time the thing that has to break is inside me instead of in some object I can hold at arm's length. You don't know that, Ron said, and his voice cracked just slightly, all his earlier battlefield bravado gone. Mate, you don't know that for certain, and if you're wrong, that's not a scar you can just. You'd be dead, actually dead, not dramatically nearly dead, properly. I know, Harry looked at both of them, at the two people who'd walked beside him through every single one of these last impossible weeks, and felt something in his chest tighten that had nothing to do with borrowed power and everything to do with simply loving people who were about to be asked to let him walk into danger without them. I'm not asking permission. I'm telling you because I'm not going to lie to either of you about where I'm going or why, not after everything. But I have to go, and I have to go now, before he regroups and disappears somewhere I can't follow. Hermione's eyes were bright with tears she was refusing, through sheer force of will, to let fall. Then we're coming with you to the tree line, at least that far. I'm not letting you walk off into the dark without at least that much. Okay, Harry said, that far. The Forbidden Forest at night looked exactly the way it always looked, ancient, watchful, indifferent to the small, desperate dramas of human wars playing out beneath its canopy, and Harry walked into it alone, past the tree line where Ron and Hermione stood, unable to follow further, both of them white-faced and silent because there was nothing left to say that either words or magic could fix. He found Voldemort waiting in a small clearing perhaps a quarter-mile in, surrounded by the remains of his inner circle, Bellatrix, wild-eyed and desperate now, sensing something in the air she couldn't name, Lucius Malfoy, gaunt and hollow, a dozen others, masked and silent, forming a loose ring around the space where their master stood. You came, Voldemort said, and something in his voice carried genuine surprise, layered over something else Harry couldn't quite name. I wondered if Severus's memory would reach you in time. I wondered more than that, whether you would actually be foolish enough to act on it. You knew, Harry said, the whole time. You knew I was a Horcrux and you never told me, and neither did Dumbledore, not directly. Everyone kept it locked away like it was too dangerous to say out loud. Because it was, Voldemort said. Dumbledore understood, I think, that if you knew too soon, you would either despair of ever being anything but a vessel for me, or you would grow reckless enough to throw your own life away trying to end it before you were ready. He was protecting you from yourself, Potter, the same way he protected everyone from everything, right up until the day he died still hiding half of what he knew. Maybe. Harry's wand was still holstered at his side, and he made no move to draw it. Doesn't matter now. I'm here, finish it. Bellatrix let out a small, strangled sound of protest, and Voldemort raised one hand, silencing her without looking away from Harry. You understand what you're asking, he said quietly. Not a duel, not a fair contest of skill. You are asking me to simply kill you, and trusting on nothing but a dead man's second-hand memory and your own certainty that something in you will survive it. I'm not trusting blindly. Harry met his eyes steadily. I've watched 5 pieces of your soul die in front of me now, and every single time, something came through to me instead of just vanishing. I don't think this time's different just because the piece happens to be living behind my own eyes instead of in a ring or a cup. I think it's the same magic, doing the same thing it's always done. And if you're wrong, then I die knowing I tried, instead of running from it and hoping someone else finds a way to finish this that doesn't cost me anything. Harry's voice didn't shake. You've spent 50 years running from exactly this moment, Tom. Building walls, splitting your soul into pieces, doing everything a person can possibly do to avoid ever standing somewhere, and simply accepting that thing's end. I'm not going to do that. I'd rather stand here and find out than spend the rest of my life wondering. Something in Voldemort's pale, ancient face shifted at that, not quite respect, not quite pity, something more complicated than either, a recognition perhaps of a courage he had spent his entire existence deciding was worthless, weak beneath him, and finding in this exact moment that he could not quite dismiss it as easily as he once had. Very well, he said, and raised his wand. Harry did not close his eyes. Avada Kedavra, the green light took him full in the chest, and there was no pain at all, only a vast, sudden falling and then nothing, and then, somehow, everything. He stood in a place that had no clear shape, bright and formless, and understood, without quite knowing how he understood it, that he was standing somewhere between one thing and another. Not quite the King's Cross station he'd half expected from some old, buried instinct, something stranger than that, older, built from fragments of every vision he'd absorbed across the last month layered over each other, until they'd become something new entirely. He saw the boy in the orphanage again, 6 years old, deciding fear was a luxury he'd simply refused to afford. He saw the boy learning occlumency brick by patient brick. He saw the young man reading a spell's shape once and reproducing it flawlessly, saw the calm, terrible foresight that had once mapped battlefields 3 moves ahead, saw the raw understanding of life and death's fragile boundary that Nagini's destruction had given him. All of it, every fragment he'd carried for the last month, gathered now in one place, and beneath all of it, waiting quietly like the last piece of a puzzle finally sliding home, something smaller and older than any of the rest. A wound, 16 years old, carried silently behind a scar, finally ready to be released. "Hello, Harry," said a voice, and he turned to find not Dumbledore, as some part of him had half expected, but something stranger, a formless, indistinct presence that felt, somehow, like every version of Tom Riddle he'd glimpsed across the last month compressed into one final, dying whisper. "You're the last piece," Harry said. "I am what's left of what he never wanted to become," the voice said, and there was something in it that sounded, impossibly, almost like relief. Every piece he split away, he told himself he was making himself stronger. He was only ever making himself smaller. "I have watched from inside you every choice you made instead of the choices he would have made, and I find that I do not want to go back to him. I would rather simply end here, quietly, than return to a man who has spent 50 years running from exactly this." "Then don't go back," Harry said. "Just stop, let it end." "It is already ending," the voice said, and faded, gently, without struggle, without the screaming fury of every previous destruction, simply dissolving into the bright, formless space around them until there was nothing left of it at all. And then there was a choice offered without words, the way all the important choices in Harry's life had somehow arrived, a path forward and a path that led nowhere at all, and Harry understood that he was genuinely free to choose either. He thought of Ron and Hermione standing at that tree line, faces pale with terror. He thought of a battle still raging, of people who needed him to still be standing at the end of it. He thought distantly of every person who had died so this exact moment could exist, and understood that letting it end here, quietly, easily, would be its own kind of betrayal of everything they'd given up. "I'm not done yet," he thought, and the bright, formless place folded away around him, and he was falling again, and then he was lying in the mud of the forest clearing, and he was breathing. The Death Eaters surrounding him had gone utterly silent, staring down at a boy who should, by every law of magic they understood, be dead, and Voldemort himself stood frozen above him, wand still raised from the curse, his pale face slack with an expression none of his followers had ever once seen him wear. "That's not possible," he said, and his voice, for the first time in this entire war, carried no composure at all, only raw, naked shock. Harry opened his eyes. He felt different immediately, not stronger exactly, not in the way each previous Horcrux had left him feeling, some new discrete ability settling into place. This felt like completion instead, like a puzzle finally finished, every fragment he'd carried across the last month suddenly fitting together into something whole rather than scattered, and beneath all of it, quiet and certain, his own self, entirely intact, entirely his, having survived carrying a piece of the most dangerous soul in Britain without once losing the shape of who he actually was. He sat up slowly, and Bellatrix, somewhere behind Voldemort, let out a strangled scream of pure disbelief. "He's the last one," Harry said, climbing to his feet, ignoring the 12 wands now swinging wildly between him and their master, uncertain which target mattered more. "The Horcrux inside me, it's gone now, which means," he looked directly at Voldemort, and something in his gaze made the Dark Lord actually take a step back. "Which means you're not immortal anymore, Tom, not even a little bit. You're just a man standing in a forest, same as anyone else." "Kill him," Voldemort said, and his voice cracked on the words, fury and fear tangled together past any hope of separation. "Kill him now, all of you." The Death Eaters surged forward, and Harry met them the way he'd met everything else across this endless, impossible night, not with fear, not with hesitation, but with the full, integrated weight of everything he'd carried, everything he'd chosen, everything he'd refused to become. He didn't draw his wand first this time. He simply raised both hands, and the ground itself seemed to answer him, roots and stone rising in a wall between himself and the charging Death Eaters, buying seconds, and in those seconds his wand was already in his hand, already moving, disarming 3 attackers in a single sweeping arc before any of them had closed half the distance. Bellatrix broke from the group, screaming something wordless and furious, and Harry caught her mid-lunge with a spell that sent her crashing backward into a tree hard enough to knock her senseless, and turned, immediately expecting more, and found instead that the remaining Death Eaters had simply stopped, staring at their fallen leader, at the impossible boy who just survived the killing curse and walked away stronger for it, and made, individually and without discussion, the same calculation about their own survival. They ran, which left only Voldemort, standing alone in the clearing, wand still raised, red eyes fixed on Harry with an expression that had finally, completely, abandoned every trace of the cold, patient superiority he'd worn for 50 years. "Just us then," Harry said. "Just us," Voldemort agreed, and something in his voice had steadied again, some last reserve of control reasserting itself even now, even with everything falling apart around him. "You think this changes the outcome, Potter? You think surviving my curse and absorbing whatever remained of that fragment makes you my equal at last?" "I don't think I need to be your equal," Harry said. "I think I already am, and I have been for a while now, and the only thing that's changed tonight is that you've finally run out of pieces of yourself to hide behind." They circled each other slowly through the clearing's churned mud, wands raised, and Harry felt, for the first time in this entire month of accumulated borrowed power, something that was entirely, uncomplicatedly his own, not fear, never fear, but a kind of fierce, focused clarity that had nothing left to prove and everything left to finish. Voldemort struck first, a rapid volley of curses meant to overwhelm through sheer speed, and Harry met every single one of them, deflecting, redirecting, occasionally simply unmaking a spell from within the way he'd learned to do against the Fiendfare and the Cruciatus both. And the fight that followed was, by any measure, the single most spectacular duel either combatant had ever fought, spells lighting the dark forest in brilliant, overlapping flashes of every color magic could produce. Trees splitting and falling around them, the ground itself cratering and reshaping under the sheer force of what they were throwing at each other. Harry felt the diadem's foresight guiding his footwork, felt the cup's mastery letting him reproduce and counter every unfamiliar curse Voldemort threw the instant he witnessed its shape, felt the locket's occlumency keeping his own mind sealed tight against any attempt to slip past his guard, felt the ring's absolute absence of fear letting him press forward into exchanges that would have driven any ordinary duelist into desperate retreat, and beneath all of it, holding everything together, felt simply himself, the boy who had chosen, every single time, not to become the thing he was fighting. "You cannot win this," Voldemort said, breathing hard now, robes scorched, a thin line of blood tracking from a cut above one eyebrow where a redirected curse had finally found purchase. "I have 50 years of skill you cannot simply borrow your way past." "You keep saying that," Harry said, "like it's going to become true if you say it with enough conviction. It hasn't worked yet." He pressed the advantage, driving forward through a combination of spells that came faster than thought now, integrated instinct guiding every motion, and Voldemort, forced backward step by step through the ruined clearing, finally made the mistake Harry had been waiting for, overextending on a curse meant to end the fight outright, committing fully to a strike that left him, for one crucial half-second, entirely open. Harry didn't hesitate. Expelliarmus. The Elder Wand tore itself free of Voldemort's grip and arced through the air, and Harry, with the same instinctive certainty that had guided every choice across this entire impossible night, raised his other hand and caught it before it could fall, so that he stood now holding two wands, and Voldemort stood before him with none at all, for the first time in longer than either of them could properly remember. "It's over," Harry said quietly. Voldemort stood very still, breathing hard, red eyes fixed on the wand now resting in Harry's palm, and something in his ancient, ruined face finally, completely collapsed, not into fury, not even into fear anymore, but into something that looked horribly like genuine grief, the grief of a man realizing, at the very last possible moment, exactly how much he had spent avoiding the ending that had all along been waiting patiently for him to arrive. "You could end it now," he said quietly. "Finish what you started. You have every reason to." Harry looked at him for a long moment, at the man who'd killed his parents, killed Cedric, killed Sirius, killed Dumbledore, killed Snape not 2 hours ago in a boathouse over a wand that had in the end never once truly belonged to him, and felt, rising up through everything he'd absorbed, everything he'd carried, everything he'd chosen not to become, a clarity that had nothing to do with mercy and everything to do with simple, unshakable justice. "I'm not going to murder you," Harry said. "That's not what this was ever about, no matter how many pieces of you I ended up carrying to get here." He raised his own wand, not the Elder Wand, his own, the one that had chosen him in a shop on Diagon Alley 6 years ago, and pointed it steadily at the man who had spent a lifetime trying to make himself into something no one could ever end. "But you don't get to walk away from what you've done either. Stupefy." The stunner took Voldemort square in the chest, and he crumpled without another word, and Harry stood over him in the ruined clearing, breathing hard, surrounded by fallen trees and scorched earth and the last, dying echoes of a fight 50 years in the making, and understood with a certainty that finally, completely, belonged entirely to himself, that it was well and truly finished. They carried him back to the castle bound in chains stronger than any Auror's usual custody spell, and the battle, when Harry emerged from the tree line with Ron and Hermione running to meet him, had already begun to fracture and scatter, Death Eaters fleeing in every direction the moment word spread of what had happened in that clearing. "You're alive," Hermione said, and then she was crying, properly crying, arms thrown around him hard enough to hurt, and Ron was there a half-second later, gripping his shoulder so tight it ached, and neither of them said anything coherent for almost a full minute, just held on, the three of them standing together in the wreckage of a night that had asked more of all of them than any of them had ever expected to survive. "He's alive too," Harry said finally, nodding at the bound, unconscious figure being carried behind him by two grim-faced Aurors who'd arrived in the battle's final hour. "I didn't kill him. I stunned him instead." Ron pulled back, staring. "You had the perfect chance and you didn't. I didn't need to." Harry looked at both of them, exhausted beyond measure, venom still aching faintly in his arm, every borrowed piece of power finally, completely settled into something that felt, for the first time all night, entirely, quietly his own. He's just a man now. No Horcruxes left, no immortality, nothing hidden away anywhere. He'll face trial like anyone else who's done what he's done, and this time there's nothing left for him to hide behind while it happens. They walked back toward the castle together, the three of them, past the wreckage and the wounded and the slow, grim work of counting the losses that would take days, weeks to fully reckon with. Neville met them at the gates, exhausted and bleeding but upright, and Luna was there too, calm as ever amid the chaos. And slowly, across the ruined grounds, word spread from student to student, from professor to professor, that it was finally, genuinely over. Harry found Draco Malfoy sitting alone on the castle steps some time later, staring out at the wreckage with an expression Harry recognized immediately, because he'd worn something close to it himself more than once across this endless month, the particular hollow look of someone trying to work out who they were supposed to be now that the thing that had shaped every choice of their life had finally, completely ended. "He's captured," Harry said, sitting down beside him without asking permission. "Alive." "Going to trial, I heard." Draco didn't look at him. "I don't know what that means for my family, for me." "Neither do I," Harry admitted. "But you helped me tonight in that room, even though you didn't have to. That's going to matter when people start sorting out who did what and why. I'll say so if it helps." Draco was quiet for a long moment. "Why do you keep doing that, helping me, after everything?" "Because I spent a month carrying pieces of the man who made you into someone who thought helping the Dark Lord win was the only way to keep your family safe," Harry said. "I understand better than I ever wanted to exactly how someone ends up choosing fear over everything else. Doesn't mean I think you're stuck being that person forever. Nobody has to be." Draco didn't answer that, not directly, but something in his exhausted, hollow expression eased very slightly, and the two of them sat together on the castle steps for a while longer, watching dawn begin to color the eastern sky over grounds that had, for one impossibly long night, become the site of the most important battle either of them would ever fight. Weeks later, when the trials had finally concluded and the last of the reconstruction had begun in earnest, Harry stood alone in the Gryffindor common room's early morning quiet, looking out over grounds slowly healing themselves under careful hands and steady magic, and thought about everything he'd carried across that impossible month: the ring's absence of fear, the locket's careful mind, the cup's effortless mastery, the diadem's foresight, Nagini's understanding of life's fragile thread, and finally, completely, the last piece that had once lived quietly behind his own scar. He didn't feel like a vessel for someone else's power anymore. He hadn't really since that bright, formless place between life and death where he'd chosen, freely and completely, to come back. What he carried now felt entirely his own, not because the abilities themselves had changed, but because he understood, finally, with a certainty nothing could shake, that power had never been the thing that determined who you became. Only choices did that. Only the small, difficult, human decisions made again and again, in forests and courtrooms and burning rooms full of forgotten treasure, to be something better than the raw material you'd been handed. Ron found him there a few minutes later, tossing him an apple and dropping into the chair beside him with the easy, exhausted comfort of someone who'd earned the right to simply exist quietly beside his friend without needing to fill the silence with anything at all. "You look like you're thinking too hard again," Ron said eventually. "Maybe a little. About what?" Harry considered the question for a long moment, looking out at grounds that had nearly burned, at a castle that had nearly fallen, at a war that had, against every reasonable expectation, actually ended. About how it turned out okay, he said finally. Not easy, not painless, but okay. I wasn't sure it would some nights. Ron nodded slowly and didn't say anything clever or funny in response, which was, in its own way, the highest compliment he knew how to give. Yeah, he said instead. Me neither. Glad it did, though. Yeah, Harry agreed, and outside, morning light spread slowly across a castle beginning, finally, to heal.